Chapter 51. Plan. Hurry up, follow up. Why did you leave so suddenly? I haven't even eaten enough of the prosciutto. There is also that yellow fruit wine, will we not be able to drink it again this time? It's fine to leave tomorrow, we haven't eaten enough food for the elves yet. Shut up, the elves are our enemies, have you forgotten? Of course I haven't forgotten, but eating up the elves' food storage cabinet is also revenge. Shut up, all of you, it's not good to be discovered by the elves. When you find it, you will find it. What are you afraid of? Anyway, we have already paid back our money. Why do you think Soren suddenly decided to leave? And didn't wait for Gandalf? I don't know, why don't you ask Soren? I'm not going. The optimistic nature of dwarves allows them to be optimistic in any environment and under any circumstances. Even in the tense environment of leaving Rivendell urgently. Morgan, who was following behind the team, couldn't help laughing when he heard the chatter between the dwarves. The expedition team encountered almost no obstacles on their way out of Rivendell. Except when arriving at the large square under Rivendell Hill and preparing to leave through the giant arch bridge. The expedition was finally discovered by the elven guards guarding the great arched bridge. Facing the guarding elf guards, Thorin Oakenshield, who can really leave Rivendell as long as he passes this bridge, is very strong. Knowing that it cannot be delayed for long, otherwise, once the hypocritical Lord Elon changes his mind, the expedition team is very likely to encounter serious troubles. Soren Oakenshield immediately pulled out the elf guards when they encountered the elf guards blocking the way. Sword. We're getting out of here now, make way. Facing the group of dwarves who spoke calmly but pointed their sharp knives at him. The elf guards guarding the bridge obviously didn't understand the situation. He knew that this group of dwarves were Lord Elon's guests. But why do guests leave secretly, especially at night? Lord Elon never said that once these dwarves want to leave, they will be forced to stay. But the dwarves can choose to leave during the day, right? Why would they be sneaky, especially at night? Did they commit something? Lord Elon did not order, should he prevent these dwarves from leaving. But they are Lord Elon's guests, what if they didn't do anything wrong? The leading elf guard was a little confused for a while. Fortunately, he was still sober, and sent someone to quickly inform Rivendell's senior management about the situation. Talk to the dwarves while doing the delay. It's just that Thorin Oakenshield, who was eager to leave, couldn't see the little tricks of the elf guards in front of him. He also became more and more sure of the plot that Lord Elon wanted to prevent his team from going to the Lonely Mountain. So also more impolite. Is this how you Rivendell treat guests? Get out of the way, or don't blame me for being rude. Thorin Oakenshield shouted in a cold voice. Because of Thorin Oakenshield's attitude, the dwarves behind him immediately brandished their weapons and roared angrily. As long as Thorin Oakenshield said a word, they could immediately rush forward and tear up the elf guards to avenge the dwarves and elves. But the elf guards, whose numbers were only limited to the expedition, did not fear the threat of the dwarves at all. Still insisting on blocking the entrance of the giant arch bridge, blocking in front of the expedition team. Thorin Oakenshield's face became more and more angry, but his heart was extremely calm. Of course he knew that at this time he could not be an enemy of Lord Elon, nor could he be against Rivendell. Even if you really want to do it, you must not kill these guards in front of you, at most you can only defeat and injure them. Otherwise, the situation is really serious. Just when the situation was at a critical moment, Thorin Oakenshield was about to teach the elf guards a lesson. The guards sent to inform Rivendell higher-ups are back. The guard who just came back said a few words in the ear of the leader elf guard. The elf guard who led the team looked at the dwarves who looked angry and their eyes were bloodshot and red, and after hesitating for a moment, they finally got out of the way. Thorin Oakenshield was overjoyed, and said coldly with an angry face, "Let's go." After speaking, he took the lead and walked quickly towards the giant arch bridge. The anger of the dwarves behind him dissipated a little, and then they followed Thorin Oakenshield cursingly and strode towards the giant arch bridge. Just when the expedition team crossed the arch bridge and quickly walked towards the rugged mountain road. In the attic on top of the hill in Rivendell, the elf queen Galadriel, who was originally standing on the edge of the attic, facing the sky and admiring the bright full moon, suddenly turned her head, looked at Gandalf on the round table in the center, and whispered, "The dwarves have left." Gandalf turned his head, looked at Galadriel and said in his heart, "That's right." Galadriel continued to speak, "You have planned it a long time ago." This time Gandalf didn't say anything, but watched Galadriel shrug slightly. Seemingly aware of Gandalf's series of plans, the Elf Queen, who had been vague about this matter, looked at Gandalf and smiled. However, because of the consideration of the face and attitude of Saruman, the white-robed wizard, who is the president of the Holy White Council, Galadriel continued to look at the full moon in the sky. Saruman, who sat opposite Gandalf, was still chattering and talking. For the white-robed wizard Saruman, he not only objected to the fact that the dwarves went to the Lonely Mountain, but he was also unhappy with Gandalf, a meddlesome guy. There is no love and hate for no reason in the world. So did Saruman. Although he was a little hard to say why he hated Gandalf at first. But it didn't matter, what Gandalf did later made him even more unhappy. This also allowed him to express his displeasure with Gandalf more openly. Just when Saruman continued to express his dissatisfaction with the dwarf expedition to the Lonely Mountain, there was a sudden sound of hurried footsteps outside the attic. Everyone turned their heads when they heard the sound, and saw Elf Linda walking in quickly. First of all, I bowed to show respect to several important figures. Then he looked at Lord Elrond and said in a deep voice, "Your Highness Elrond, those dwarves are gone." Time passed slowly. When the eastern sky began to glow with white clouds, the full moon completely disappeared into the sky. On a rugged mountain road not far from Rivendell, the expedition team is advancing steadily. Seeing that the elves really won't appear behind him, Thorin Oakenshield's expression became much more relaxed. The expedition's biggest puzzle, the secret of the Lonely Mountain map, has been solved. Pangburrow and Boffer also recovered from their injuries, and the rest of the members also recovered very well. There are also these large and small bags of dry food and drinks on the team members. Thorin Oakenshield just felt that this trip to Rivendell was just right. Gandalf's plan was very good indeed. Everyone be vigilant, we are about to step into the wilderness. Bahrain, you know the way, and you are at the forefront. Looking up at the sky and the road ahead, Thorin Oakenshield gave orders. Bilbo looked at Rivendell, who was getting farther and farther behind him, feeling inexplicable in his heart. At this moment, he looked at Bilbo, who was walking slowly and looking back frequently. Thorin Oakenshield said, "Master Baggins, I suggest you follow quickly." Hearing Thorin Oakenshield's somewhat ironic address, Bilbo sighed inwardly. Quickly walked towards Morgan in front. Chapter 52. The reason why you must participate. When the figure of Rivendell, the capital of elves behind Morgan, became smaller and smaller, and finally disappeared from everyone's eyes. All the members of the expedition team have now completely left Rivendell. Wide sea diving, sky high the birds to fly. Soren Oakenshield, who felt that he was free from restraint, was in a good mood. When talking with Morgan from time to time, he even took the initiative to ask Morgan about some things about bounty hunters. You must know that during the journey of more than a month before, except for some matters within the team, Thorin Oakenshield seldom spoke, let alone took the initiative to talk to anyone. The actions of Soren Oakenshield seemed to other members of the expedition team to be the reason why Soren trusted Morgan. But in Morgan's own opinion, it was not simply the reason for trusting him. First, as the members of the expedition team saw, Thorin Oakenshield did have some trust in Morgan. That is because of Morgan's strength. In the previous battles with orcs and trolls, Morgan's strength is obvious to all. It was also because Morgan's identity was different from that of the dwarves. It doesn't belong to a group of dwarves, all of them are Thorin Oakenshield's subordinates, they are his people. Thorin Oakenshield kept his identity, except for work, so naturally he wouldn't talk much with the dwarves. Morgan wasn't like the wizard Gandalf, who couldn't even figure out his real and specific thoughts, and tried his best to help his wizard. This limited Thorin Oakenshield's trust in Gandalf. It's not like Morgan has no ability at all. He only relies on Gandalf's relationship to join the team, and Bilbo, a halfling who needs to be rescued by others at critical times. So Thorin Oakenshield didn't think much of Bilbo at all. Compared with the above three, the bounty hunter Morgan is powerful and simple in purpose. This made it easier for Thorin Oakenshield, who was suspicious by nature, to trust Morgan. Although Morgan himself is also suspicious and cautious by nature. After unraveling the secret of the Lonely Mountain map, the team members were refreshed, and also received dry food, supplies and drinks, and used Rivendell to get rid of the orcs' pursuit. It can be said that the mental state of the entire expedition team members is very good. Except that Bilbo was a little melancholy. Without the pursuit of the orcs, even the attacks of some wild beasts encountered during the journey were nothing to this elite expedition team. The expedition team was repaired from Rivendell and continued on the road. Over the mountains and wilderness, across the snow mountain forest. When the expedition team stood at the foot of a mountain range full of rocks. It has been more than half a month since the group left Rivendell. Boom! Boom! The sky was dark and gloomy, and thunder was rolling in the sky. Looking at the vast mountains with sparse vegetation and bare sandy rocks. Thorin Oakenshield looked heavy. Barain, is this the only way? Thorin Oakenshield turned to look at Balin, the white-bearded dwarf. Balin understood what Thorin Oakenshield meant. Such rocky mountains, and the thunderstorm weather that is about to face. The difficulty and danger of the journey will rise sharply. The road ahead will be very difficult. The most unacceptable thing is that there is no place around that is suitable for shelter from the rain. There is none left. Well, it's not completely absent. There is still a way, if we are willing to spend an extra month. Balin shook his head first, then nodded, and spoke after a little consideration. No. The day of Turin is not far away, we cannot afford to waste a month. Hearing Balin's words, Thorin Oakenshield, who originally thought there were other options, immediately rejected the other way that Balin said. Come on, we'll spend the night on the mountain tonight. Thorin Oakenshield turned around and shouted at the members behind him, then took the lead and walked up the mountain. Morgan stood beside Balin, not saying a word to the conversation between the two dwarves. At this time Thorin Oakenshield made a move, and Morgan immediately followed. The memory plot in Morgan's mind naturally has memories of this journey, and it is still very deep. If the plot in memory is roughly unchanged, the expedition team will then encounter the legendary Battle of Stone Giants. The battle scene was earth-shattering, and the members of the expedition team involved in it were extremely dangerous. When Morgan saw this scene in the movie in his previous life, he was really sweating for the expedition team. In his opinion, the most dangerous and difficult moment for the entire expedition team was this scene. I believe that everyone who has seen the movie has a similar feeling. To be frank, half a month ago, when I was in Rivendell, I thought about whether to stay in Rivendell with Gandalf. After all, the scene where the expedition team encountered the Battle of Stone Giants was too thrilling. The half-orcs I saw in front of the movie screen in my previous life didn't feel that there was too much danger. On the contrary, because of the ugliness and stupidity of the half-orcs, I even thought these cannon fodder tricks were a bit cute. But after coming to this world, he saw and fought the half-orc for the first time. Morgan put away such childish thoughts. He was sure that all he had to do was see the half-orc with his own eyes. I can't help but feel the cuteness of half-orcs in my heart. You can imagine, when a dozen tall and strong men with sharp weapons and hungry stomachs are facing a fat pig. When you are that fat pig, face monsters who want to kill and eat you at any time, or even tear you alive. Do you still think the other person is cute? It was only after seeing the ferocity of the orcs with his own eyes that Morgan felt a certain hesitation about the scene where the expedition team encountered the stone giant. Half-orcs are so cruel, facing the battle between the mountain-like stone giants, the degree of danger is definitely several times more dangerous than what is shown in the movie screen. Morgan is not the main character, he has no aura of immortality. Although he now has a certain ability to protect himself in Middle-earth, he doesn't want to seek death. Morgan naturally didn't want to go through this if he could. However, he signed an employment contract with Thorin Oakenshield. Then, and most importantly, Gandalf, Thorin Oakenshield and the dwarf Barain knew about the Rivendell plan. They didn't tell Morgan. Even though Morgan's strength and other aspects are very good along the way, the fact that his origin is unknown is enough to make the three of them fearful. Although Morgan knew all their plans in his mind, the three of them didn't say it clearly. Morgan can only act as if he doesn't know anything. Without knowing the plan of all this, there is naturally no reason to stay. What's more, this trip is also a journey that Morgan must participate in if he wants to obtain the Supreme Lord of the Rings. Because after the expedition team survived the Battle of the Stone Giants by chance, they will encounter the biggest turning point in the entire movie. And the protagonist is Bilbo Baggins, who has no presence in the team along the way. Bilbo will meet the monster Gollum in the underground Goblin Kingdom next, and then pick up the Supreme Lord of the Rings that Gollum regards as a treasure very easily behind Gollum. If Morgan wants to get the ring, he must get it before Bilbo. Otherwise, once Bilbo succeeds, it will be very difficult for Morgan to get the ring from his opponent because of the invisible ability of the Lord of the Rings. This is why Morgan must be involved. As for why the Lord of the Rings is sought, it will affect the plot changes in memory. This question is too simple. Because the Lord of the Rings can be invisible. Even as long as your willpower is strong enough, the Lord of the Rings can keep you invisible forever. Such an absolute life-saving artifact. What reason does Morgan have to give up? What's more, once he gets the Supreme Lord of the Rings, he will naturally become a plot character who can stir up the situation in Middle-earth. At that time, whatever he does, he can increase the progress of the world exploration in his body, without having to keep chasing behind the characters in the plot. Believe that at that time, the importance of the Lord of the Rings. I am afraid that the plot characters will gather around him, and there is no need for him to actively approach the plot characters. Of course, all of the above are speculations by Morgan. But the possibility is extremely high. If Morgan can really get the Supreme Lord of the Rings and control it. His thoughts above are no longer speculations. Having the future plot in mind is indeed an important reliance for Morgan to survive in this world. But if the memory of the plot can be replaced with the Supreme Lord of the Rings, Morgan will not hesitate to replace it. Morgan knows the plot in order to survive. But if it can be replaced with the Supreme Lord of the Rings, that can greatly improve his combat effectiveness, and allow him to save his life and survive better. Morgan has no reason not to change. Of course, all of this is possible only if Morgan can successfully capture and control the Supreme Lord of the Rings. For now, it's just Morgan's plan. If the capture of the ring fails, then everything is empty talk. Boom! The sky is getting darker, the thunder is roaring, and the dark clouds are constantly churning and gathering. Not far from the rainstorm, a dozen or so members of the expedition team were struggling to walk on an extremely rugged and steep rocky trail. A group of people started from Hobbiton, and the journey took 3 months, all the way to here. Middle-earth has gone through countless steep mountains, rivers, snow-capped mountains, and wilderness. It is not uncommon to see rugged and dangerous mountain roads, but the narrow trail that is under their feet is definitely the most dangerous one that the expedition team has traveled. This path is basically made of rocks, one side is close to the steep rock wall, and the other side is the dark, deep, and terrifying cliff. The true width of the walk in the middle of the trail is no more than a foot wide, about 30 centimeters. Most people would feel panicked just looking at such a scary trail. Not to mention standing on it, but also carrying packages and walking on it with weapons and equipment. The dwarf Boffer walked slowly with one hand on the uneven stone wall, turned his head and looked at the dark abyss next to him, felt dizzy, and said loudly, "This is definitely the last time I walk like this way out, I swear." Dory, the dwarf who was walking in front of Boffer, immediately replied, "You can't swear, it's up to Thorin to say it." Philly, the dwarf who was walking at the end, cast a glance at the dark abyss behind him, and followed suit. "This road should be the most difficult road since we set off." The dwarf Dwellin in front also spoke, "I wonder who would have dug such a road." Hearing the brother behind him speak, the white-bearded Bahrain who followed closely behind Soren Oakenshield said, "This road doesn't seem to be specially dug out, it's more like a natural formation." Morgan, who was walking behind the dwarf Dwellin, glanced at the abyss beside him, took a deep breath, calmed down, and continued to move forward. It's just that the team was moving slowly, and listening to the dwarves who were chatting leisurely, Morgan finally couldn't help but said, "I think we should use our energy to find a place to shelter from the rain as soon as possible, not chat. It's going to rain soon, and it doesn't look like the rain will be small, and it will be troublesome then." The cold wind howled on the mountainside next to the abyss, the sky was dark, the dark clouds were rolling, and the sky was billowing with thunder. Everything indicated that a heavy rain was coming. After Morgan finished speaking, Soren Oakenshield, who was at the forefront of the team, immediately looked up at the sky, and then at the speed of the team. Then he immediately turned his head and said loudly, "Morgan is right, we need to speed up and try to find a place to rest before it rains. Pay attention to the safety of your feet, and follow behind." When Thorin Oakenshield opened his mouth, everyone immediately shut up. Speeding forward on such a dangerous narrow path, whoever dares to distract and chat is courting death. Just then, Bilbo, who was walking behind Morgan, made a sound. "Hey, what do you see that is?" Everyone looked in the direction of Bilbo's finger, and saw a goat-like animal with sharp horns on its head, standing on the more dangerous rocky slope above the expedition, looking at them. "My God, what animal is that? It can stand there, isn't it afraid of falling down? It's not small enough to give us a good meal. Morgan, can you shoot it? It's too steep up there. It's no use shooting it. It'll fall." Morgan shook his head and spoke loudly. Right at this moment. Boom! A blinding flash of lightning pierced the dark sky. Immediately afterwards, bean-sized raindrops slammed down. Hwa 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 hwa. Hwa 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 hwa. Like pouring, no, this is not just like pouring, but like a hole has been broken in the sky, and the heavy rain is pouring down directly from the hole. The rain hit everyone in the expedition team, not to mention continuing to move forward, and they couldn't even open their eyes for a while. Immediately, the sky and the earth were covered with mist. The whole sky grew darker. Soren Oakenshield tried his best to open his eyes. Facing the heavy rain, he turned his head and shouted at the team members behind him who were temporarily unable to lift their heads due to the heavy rain, "We can't stop here. Stand up, hold on tight, watch your step. We're going to keep going." Thorin Oakenshield's voice finally brought the dazed people back to their senses. The expedition continued to advance with difficulty in the torrential rain. At this moment, the dwarf Dwellin suddenly looked at the sky and his face changed suddenly, and then he shouted with all his strength, "Be careful." When Dwellin spoke, everyone immediately raised their heads. Then, I saw a huge and extremely black thing, like a meteorite, flying from a distant mountain to the mountain where everyone was. 2 in 1 big chapter. Thank you Inner Mongolia Xiaopeng book friend for the reward, thank you very much. Chapter 53. The Battle of the Stone Giants. Boom! The huge boulder suddenly hit the mountain peak above the heads of the expedition team, making a loud noise. The ground shook for a while, and the moment the huge boulder hit the mountain, it immediately shattered into countless large and small stones and rolled down one after another. "Be careful, hurry up." Thorin Oakenshield clung to the stone wall beside him and turned his head to roar. The gravel that rolled down from the heads of the expedition team was of different sizes, the large ones were several tons, and the small ones were the size of a palm. The torrential rain mixed with countless gravels suddenly fell down. In an instant, the slightly protruding path below was severely damaged, and large sections of the path were smashed and collapsed and fell straight into the dark abyss below. Let a group of people who are clinging to the side of the stone wall of the trail exclaim again and again. At this time, the rainstorm was fierce. The sky thundered. Dazzling lightning bolts pierced the dark sky one after another. At this moment, the white-bearded dwarf Balin looked forward and said loudly, "This is not a thunderstorm, this is simply a war. Look!" Everyone who had just recovered from the gravel rain immediately looked in the direction of Balin's finger. Boom! A dazzling thunder flashed. With the help of the light of lightning, everyone immediately saw the dark sky with torrential rain ahead. A mountain came alive, that's right, a mountain, a majestic rocky mountain range came alive. Soon, following the movement of the mountain in the distance opposite, the members of the expedition team finally saw clearly the mountain that came back to life. It actually had a decent human figure, with 2 legs and hands, and a head in the middle. Although the other party's feet, hands, and head were all countless times larger than humans and dwarves. At this time, the dwarf Boffer looked at the incomparably huge and towering figure in the dim sky in the distance, as if it should not exist in this world. He couldn't help muttering, "My God, the legend is actually true. That's a giant, the legendary stone giant." With the dwarf Boffer's terrified cry it fell. In the distant sky, the majestic stone giant who seemed to have appeared only from legends suddenly carried a huge stone with both hands and threw it towards the direction of the expedition team. "Careful! Dodge! Hurry up!" Looking at the huge shadow-like rock in the sky, someone immediately exclaimed. At this time, the crowd didn't need anyone to shout at all, everyone knew that they were clenching and trying their best to cling to the stone wall beside them. Only this time, the boulder thrown by the stone giant was not aimed at the small and ant-like members of the expedition team at all. Huge boulders as large as shadows flew past the mountain where the expedition team was. It was about to hit another huge stone giant emerging from behind the team. Boom! The huge boulder slammed on another stone giant and burst immediately. It's just that no matter how big the boulder is, it is still far behind the stone giant. Even if it hit the chest of the newly appeared stone giant, it only made the opponent stagger back a step. The stone giant who was smashed was obviously not to be outdone. As soon as he raised his hand, a boulder with a larger shadow than the one just now was easily lifted up by the stone giant, and then thrown towards the opposite stone giant in the distance. Boom! The battle between the 2 majestic stone giants has come and gone, throwing boulders at each other. For a moment, the whole world trembled and shook. Coupled with continuous downpours, lightning, and thunder, this mountain range under the dark sky is like the end of the day. At this time, everyone in the expedition team curled up and clung to the side of the stone wall, not daring to move, for fear of attracting attention. Originally, everyone wanted to wait for the two big shots to finish fighting before leaving. But the simple attack method of two stone giants running boulders at each other is quickly over. One of the stone giants seemed to think that throwing stones was not as good as punching the flesh directly. After resisting a boulder shell from the opposite stone giant, he dropped the boulder he had already lifted and strode towards his opponent. Dark sky, pouring rain. In the rain, towering stone giants with a height of hundreds of meters or even thousands of meters came step by step from the dark cliff abyss in the distance. Every step made the whole earth tremble. Be careful! The stone giant is coming. He can't see us, don't move around. Hide well. Facing the legendary stone giant walking slowly, every dwarf's face was full of horror. Thorin Oakenshield roared with all his might, trying his best to appease the members of the expedition team. At this moment, facing the approaching legendary creature, the dwarves were all frightened and apprehensive. Looking at the majestic figure of the stone giant, Morgan was also filled with shock and awe. He suddenly remembered the three giant rock trolls he had encountered nearly a month ago. The largest of the three trolls was nearly 5 meters tall and strong, not too small. But compared with the stone giant in front of him, it is not at the same level at all. If the two were to fight, the rock giant would probably be able to crush all three trolls into a pulp with just one lift of their feet. Such a stone giant as huge as a mammoth mountain range, if you hadn't seen it with your own eyes, you would never be able to imagine the shock. Even Morgan's current vision and thinking breadth have been very wide open. Even in the back of my mind, there are related plot memories, and I am prepared for the scene I will face this time. But when you really face this mythical supernatural creature, Morgan was still shocked. Such a terrifying creature, if you want to deal with yourself or the entire expedition team, it is a breeze. In such a situation, there is no need to do anything directly, but the aftermath of the battle is enough to make the expedition team overwhelmed. Morgan suddenly thought that even the evil dragon Smog, who was raging in Middle-earth and dominating the Lonely Mountain, would probably be easily crushed to death in the face of such a rock giant. Bang bang! The earth is shaking, the earth is trembling. As the two rock giants with a stature as tall as a mountain are constantly approaching. Everyone in the expedition team shivered as they curled up against the stone wall halfway up the mountain. Seeing that he was about to be in the center of the battle between the two rock giants, Morgan finally became anxious. Thorin, we should go. Morgan stood up and shouted, risking falling off the cliff. Thorin Oakenshield also woke up immediately at this time, looked around at the two rock giants, and immediately turned his head and shouted at everyone. This will be the battlefield of these giants. We can't stay here any longer. Get up, we should go. Thorin Oakenshield roared. A group of dwarves were not slow to react, even though the mountains beside them, the path under their feet, the surroundings, and even the whole world were shaking and trembling. The members of the expedition still stood up, shaking like an earthquake, and moved forward with difficulty. It's just that the sky fails to fulfill people's wishes. Just before the expedition team started to move on, suddenly, they noticed that the mountain beside them and under their feet suddenly shook violently. Unlike being shaken by two rock giants, everyone in the expedition team could clearly feel the vibration, which came from the mountain itself beside them and under their feet at this moment. The vibration became more and more violent. A large number of boulders began to fall from the top of the mountain. Everyone in the expedition team finally noticed something was wrong. Not good. Be careful. This mountain is about to collapse. Beware of rocks. Hurry up. Everyone panicked. Finally, in the increasingly violent shaking, the members of the expedition team finally saw where the violent vibration came from. Another rock giant as towering as a mountain stood up. And the position where everyone in the expedition team is at this time is at the calf of this rock giant. It means that the expedition team has been walking and climbing on this rock giant. But at this moment, the rock giant was awakened by the other two fighting rock giants. Boom! It is different from those two rock giants in the distance. Because they were too close, everyone in the expedition team looked up, but they couldn't even see the rock giant's head. Also because it was too close, the rock giant moved slightly. It was almost an earth-shattering disaster for the entire expedition members. The torrential rain continued. Thunder and lightning continued in the sky. A large number of boulders began to fall off because of the rock giant's sobriety. All members of the expedition team could only cling tightly to the stone wall beside them, grasping everything that could make them feel safe. Accompanied by a large number of falling rocks. Finally, the rock giant under his feet began to stand up, This large-scale movement immediately caused a mountain gap to open in the middle of the entire mountain. The fissure ran right down to the middle of the trail where the expedition team was. It's just that the cracks in the mountain cracked too fast. The members of the expedition who happened to be right behind the team hadn't had time to react. The gap in the mountain quickly split into a distance of tens of meters. The whole mountain is directly divided into two. A third rock giant with a tall stature that was not inferior to the other two rock giants finally appeared. The trivial and simple action of the rock giant standing up immediately caused the expedition team to explode. Seeing the dwarves Keely, Boffer, Bomber, Oli, and Bifer, these dwarves were quickly taken away from the team because they stood on the other ankle of the rock giant. Soren Oakenshield, Morgan Balin, and others could only watch helplessly and had no choice but to do anything. When it first appeared, the rock giant who was the closest had finally arrived. It doesn't matter who the new rock giant is. The rock giant who rushed up raised his huge rock fist and punched the head of the rock giant where the expedition team was. Boom! There was a violent collision sound like sparks hitting the earth. Countless rocks rolled down one after another. The new rock giant who hadn't fully stood still was stunned by a punch from the rushing rock giant, and his body immediately fell to the side mountain. Morgan, Thorin Oakenshield, and all the members standing together, almost followed the overturned rock giant and fell to the mountain beside them in the incomparably thrilling. It seems to be a burst of good luck, or maybe fate is helping. Boom! The two mountain peaks crashed into each other. Not only are the members of the expedition team okay, but they just connected the trails that were broken before. Fast! Jump up! Hurry up! The members Morgan and Thorin Oakenshield finally jumped onto a safe mountain beside them. At this time, the rock giant, who had just punched dryly, finally woke up, stood up again, raised his hand, and punched the rock giant in front of him with a fist like a hill. Boom! 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 Just when the two rock giants punched each other, you came and I went back and forth. Suddenly, the other rock giant, who was a little farther away and ignored, suddenly stopped and picked up an extremely huge boulder. It just threw it at the two rock giants who were fighting with each other. It was a coincidence that the huge boulder flew towards him rapidly. It just hit Keely, the head of the rock giant where Boffer and the others were. The boulder is huge, and the impact of the rapid flying is full. This throw was extremely sharp, and immediately smashed the hit rock giant's head and flew to the ground. Whether the headless rock giant will die or not, no one knows. However, Keely and Boffer, who were at the calf of the rock giant whose head had been smashed off, and several members of the expedition team followed the rock giant to the ground, and quickly slammed into the mountain peak beside them, and were immediately frightened and screamed again and again. Morgan, Thorin Oakenshield, Balin, and the others who were standing on the slightly safer path were also exclaimed. It's just that the dwarves Keely, Boffer, and Bomber this time are far less lucky than Morgan and Thorin Oakenshield. The rock giant led the dwarves like Keely Boffer, Bomber Beaver, who were in danger, and slammed into the mountain not far away, and they just slammed into a huge raised rock. The speed was so fast that these people had no time to react, so they bumped into it suddenly. Boom! No! No! Keely! The dwarves Thorin Oakenshield and Balin Dwarin immediately looked dumbfounded. The place where the dwarves were hit was not far from Morgan's group. Thorin Oakenshield roared and rushed forward. The dwarves behind also rushed up eagerly. I saw those unlucky dwarves lying in a pile of rubble, and they seemed to be unharmed. How is everything? Thorin Oakenshield asked quickly. Fine. Just dangerous. It's okay, we're still alive. Very lucky. The dwarves spoke one after another. Thorin Oakenshield and the members of the expedition team who were chasing after him also heaved a sigh of relief. Bilbo trotted beside Morgan. Suddenly, the sand, gravel and soil loosened under his feet, and Bilbo stepped on the ground. Morgan! Bilbo hastily exclaimed and opened his mouth. Morgan noticed the abnormality and reacted very quickly, and suddenly stretched out his hand and fished it back. Then he caught Bilbo's little short hand. It was only then that everyone came to their senses. Seeing Bilbo falling in mid-air, they felt that danger was everywhere. Hurry up, I'm working hard. Morgan spoke, and with a sudden force in his hand, he pulled Bilbo up. Hoo-hoo! Bilbo came up with a pale face and gasped heavily. If Morgan hadn't reacted quickly just now, he really would have died straight away. It's all right, we almost lost the snitch. Dwalin, who originally wanted to help, looked at Bilbo, who was pulled up by Morgan and was in a daze, and smiled. At this moment, Thorin Oakenshield suddenly turned his head to look at Bilbo and said calmly. He was at a loss when he left his hometown, and it is not surprising that he died halfway. He shouldn't have followed us, he has no place among us. Thorin Oakenshield calmly said, turned, and walked forward. The other dwarves quickly followed. Morgan walked at the end and stood beside Bilbo, helped the pale Bilbo up, patted Bilbo on the shoulder and said with a smile, Thorin is angry, don't take it to heart. You are a member of our expedition team, don't be discouraged. You and I were both found by Gandalf, and we must not disappoint Gandalf. Being comforted so kindly by Morgan, Bilbo, who had just been reprimanded by Thorin Oakenshield in public and was extremely depressed, immediately felt a lot more comfortable. Morgan, you saved my life and I will remember it. Bilbo spoke seriously. Morgan just smiled, motioned him to follow quickly, and then walked forward quickly. 2 in 1 big chapter. Thank you Ming Di, Xiu'er's daily book shortage, Han Jiutiangzialu for their rewards, thank you very much. Chapter 54. Turning Point. The trail leads to a rock cave at the end. Thorin Oakenshield carried the elven sword on his back and walked into the cave first with a battle axe in his hand. The inside of the cave is quite spacious, there is no debris on the ground, and it looks clean. At this time, the dwarves who followed came in. Thorin Oakenshield ordered, it looks very safe, search around, the caves are usually owned by the owner. As soon as the voice fell, the dwarves behind them immediately scattered and searched. At this time, Morgan walked in with a longbow and quiver in his own package, and an elf sword in his hand. According to the plot in his memory, he knew that this cave was used by the goblins in the underground kingdom to hunt. Moreover, just under the feet of everyone, there is an underground goblin kingdom hidden. Although he knew it well, Morgan had no intention of telling anyone else. Not only because he couldn't explain to others why he would perceive the meaning of knowing. Moreover, encountering the incident of the Goblin Kingdom was an important turning point for the entire expedition. Bilbo Baggins, who was reprimanded by Thorin Oakenshield for being idle and unable to adapt, will get the Lord of the Rings in this event. The Supreme Lord of the Rings that will affect the situation of the entire Middle-earth world in the future. From the very beginning, Morgan knew that since he came to Middle-earth, he had bothered to get the Supreme Lord of the Rings. Now, the best time to start is about to come, and Morgan is eyeing it. After a while, the dwarves who searched the cave returned. There is nothing here. Me too, I didn't see anything. Same, nothing, it's too clean here. At this time, the last member of the search team, the dwarf Groin, came back with a pile of dead wood in his arms, threw it on the ground, and said, I found some dry wood, let's start a fire. This firewood is not enough, I will look for it again. That's exactly what they thought after a thunderstorm and the survivors of a few terrifying battles with towering stone giants. I was about to start the fire, and when I was about to come back from collecting more firewood, Thorin Oakenshield suddenly said, no, we cannot light fire here. Let's all rest here. Bahrain, take out the dried meat and drinks, we'll rest after eating, and we'll set off at dawn tomorrow. Thorin Oakenshield said he was about to find a clean and suitable place to sit down. Balin, the white-bearded dwarf, stepped forward immediately, and said in a deep voice, we should wait for Gandalf to join us in the mountains. This is a good plan. Plans will change. Thorin Oakenshield shook his head as he spoke, and then continued to order, Boffer, you are the first to watch the night, Bomber, you are the second. After giving the order, Thorin Oakenshield sat down leaning against the stone wall behind him. Balin looked at Thorin Oakenshield several times before hesitating to speak. Finally, Bahrain still did not speak. He knew Thorin didn't like elves, and neither did he. Since being half-fooled and half-forced by Gandalf to come to Rivendell, Thorin did not trust Gandalf so much, at least not at first. But Gandalf the wizard's plan is pretty much right so far. The team was also able to continue on the road because of Gandalf's plan. In Bahrain's view, at least in terms of planning, Thorin should give Gandalf a little more trust. Only Thorin is the king of all Turin dwarves. As for Thorin's decision, as long as it is not an obvious mistake, or something that will lead to serious consequences, Bahrain will not question or oppose Thorin's decision. Like now. Shaking his head, Balin took the package from the dwarves and began to distribute dry food and drinks to everyone. Just as the expedition team rested, ate and drank in the underground goblin hunting cave. It was still raining outside. Hey, hey, hey. Boom. It was dark and gloomy. The thunder still rumbled in the sky. Clap clap. The extremely dazzling electric light exploded and lit up the dark sky. The original 3 majestic and gigantic stone giants had already disappeared. In the barren wasteland where the expedition team began to go up the mountain, a group of ugly and hideous cavalry riding tall and ferocious wargs and half-orcs appeared in the rain. The leader is a pale orc with a black and dirty skin that is completely different from other half-orcs, and a strong half-orc who is much larger than ordinary half-orcs. It seems that I am not used to it, or maybe I disdain it. The pale orc leader only wore a piece of leather armor on his lower body, while his upper body was completely naked. The half-orc's upper body was covered with solid muscles, and there were a large number of hideous scars of various shapes. Ugly, with a mouth full of black messy fangs, and the same hideous scars on his face. This is a very fierce, powerful, and evil half-orc that everyone will feel at first glance. The pale half-orc was tall and strong, with an ugly and fierce face, and his fierce aura was far superior to that of ordinary half-orcs. The same goes for the warg it sits on. This is a ferocious white warg with a body length of nearly 4 meters and a body hair as hard as white steel needles. No matter how strong it is, this wolf king is far superior to ordinary grey, black and white wolf kings. At this time, it is baring its teeth and constantly sniffing the breath of the wet ground. Soon, the pale and strong half-orc said in a deep voice, "The smell of the dwarf dogs has not dissipated. They want to cross these mountains. Not far away. Pass my order to release the news that the bounty has doubled again. This time, I will make these short bastards completely extinct." Looking at the dim mountains and the heavy rain in the distance, the pale orc said with a ferocious face. "Yes, master." A half-orc respectfully responded. Soon, a black raven with red eyes flew out of the team. "Go, they haven't gone far yet. In this weather, they can't go fast." Looking at the increasingly dark rain, the pale orc spoke in a deep voice. Immediately, his legs pinched the wolf's abdomen, and the tall and fierce white wolf rushed out immediately. The half-orc crowd followed immediately. A large group of orc warg knights quickly disappeared into the darkness of the vast wind and rain. In the dark cave, the expedition team was still chewing jerky and drinking wine. With previous experience, also benefited from the generosity of the elves. The expedition brought a lot of drinks from Rivendell this time. Under Bahrain's moderate control, these drinks can be consumed for at least half a month. Although the members of the expedition can't drink as much as they did in Rivendell. But now I can drink wine for dinner every day. Compared with before, I am very happy. Morgan chewed the jerky, closed his eyes after drinking a little wine, leaned against the stone wall and closed his eyes to rest his mind. There are many and important things to do next, and now it is the most important thing to take the time to rest and nourish your energy. And experienced the previous stone giant war. A group of dwarves were also very tired today, and no one was in the mood to chat. After eating and drinking, the cave soon heard one after another snoring. In the dark, Bilbo curled up in a corner of the cave, thinking quietly. He can't sleep. It doesn't matter if Thorin Oakenshield said such ugly words in public. Or human Morgan's comforting words. Or think of all the actions I have made along the way. Bilbo felt a little uneasy tonight. But it should be Morgan's comfort and encouragement along the way. Although Bilbo had the idea of leaving the expedition team, it was not strong. As Morgan said before, "You and I were both found by Gandalf, we can't let Gandalf down." Yes, he wouldn't disappoint Gandalf, Morgan could. Bilbo believed he could do it too. Just when Bilbo was thinking about the future, the elven short sword pressed by his waist was constantly emitting a faint blue light. Chapter 55. Misstep. Time passed slowly. When the grunting of the dwarves gradually became louder. When the light in the cave is getting darker. Suddenly, small grooves appeared on the ground full of fine sand and dust. The sand, gravel, and dust began to fall continuously. The slight rustling sound could have fooled the sleeping dwarves, as well as Boffer who was dozing in front of the cave entrance. But he couldn't hide it from Morgan, who was preparing to close his eyes and pretend to sleep. Coming. Sensing the movement, Morgan immediately opened his eyes. I saw the sand, stones, and dust on the ground under everyone kept falling down. Morgan pulled out the elven sword, and then shouted loudly, "Wake up!" After the voice fell, even though they were in a deep sleep, the reaction speed of all the dwarves was very fast. Almost all of them woke up after being yelled out by Morgan. "What's wrong? What happened? Is the half-orc chasing you?" Before Morgan could answer, the rustling sound suddenly increased. Immediately afterwards, a group of people heard vibrations from the thick gravel under their feet. Thorin Oakenshield reacted the fastest, and immediately realized the seriousness of the situation and immediately shouted, "Be careful!" The voice just fell. Click! Something is opened. Next second, the ground of the entire cave seemed to be sinking, and it suddenly collapsed. At this moment, the gravel, dust, and a group of dwarves immediately fell downward. Even Morgan, who was prepared, and Thorin Oakenshield, who had already reacted, were the same. Kikai fell down amidst the rumbling sound of the organ opening. Morgan, who had been waiting for this moment for a long time, was not at all flustered by the dwarves. When it fell, he had already raised the elf sword in his hand. At the moment when he and a group of members of the expedition fell to the slope passage below, Morgan suddenly stabbed the long sword in his hand deeply into the sand and rocks of the slope passage. Ah ah ah! The dwarves screamed and immediately rolled down the ramp. Only Morgan stabbed the elf sword fiercely between the sand and stones of the passage, and was nailed to the slope passage. Did not roll down with the expedition team. Call! Morgan let out a long breath, gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, and looked at the environment of the surrounding passages and couldn't help but secretly rejoice. Fortunately, I didn't use a short sword just now, but a long sword. With such sand and rocks, the depth of the short sword's penetration is simply not enough to hang the weight of your own body. If you really want to use a dagger, I'm afraid that you will be surrounded by countless goblins rushing up like the dwarves. So far so good. Taking a few deep breaths, Morgan slowly got up from the passage and stood up straight. Although this passage is a steep slope that has been dug out. But as long as you don't fall and walk carefully, there is no problem at all. The reason why the rest of the expedition team kept rolling all the way was because they just fell with huge inertia. They can't stop at all. Surrounded by sand and stone, this is a channel that has been dug out. There is only this channel that can always pass below. Morgan walked carefully in the dark passage with the elven sword in his hand, and walked down slowly. Ah 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 ah! The exclamations of all the members of the expedition team are still echoing. Through the echo of the voice, Morgan reckoned that this passage would not be short. Morgan continued forward, and soon walked into a tunnel that had been hollowed out in the middle. In the dim tunnel, Morgan just walked in, and a large group of huge bats were startled flying around. Thanks to the previous adventures, there are also reasons for strengthening the four major attributes of the body. Morgan's night vision ability is now much stronger than before, and he can barely see the dim tunnel in front of him. Morgan moved on. There were constant exclamations from below. But there was a burst of noise, cursing, strange screams, and the sound of fighting. Morgan knew that the other members of the expedition team should have fallen completely and had a fight with the goblin monsters below. Morgan proceeded cautiously. At this moment, a stone stepped on by his feet suddenly loosened and rolled away. Morgan's figure was tilted, and his other foot stepped on the already steep dark passage, and he immediately lost his footing. Morgan breathed out the fragrance, and then fell to the ground. Immediately afterwards, his whole body rolled straight to the passage below. Morgan held the long sword in his hand tightly, trying to be the same as before, but the long sword was too long, and his body was rolling too fast, so he couldn't do it at all. In the huge turbulence, Morgan knew that he might roll to the bottom like the rest of the expedition team. So he gave up struggling, tried his best to hold his head, and let himself roll down the dark passage. Time went back to a few minutes ago, at the exit below the passage. With loud screams and a dozen figures descended from the sky into the huge bowl-shaped cage. Waiting around, a dense group of goblin monsters armed with various weapons, short, ugly, dirty, with distorted facial features, and half-orcs all rushed up crazily. There's new food again. Catch them. These guys are ugly, uglier than us. Wow, it's a dwarf. I heard that the meat of the dwarves is thick and juicy, and they taste very strong. It's just that there is too much hair on the body, unlike us. Catch them. The ugly goblins swarmed up, roaring and screaming with great interest. Go away, you filthy things. Let me go. Damn, what kind of monsters are these? Let me go, go away. Go away, you monsters. You will pay the price. Before all the dwarves could react, they had already been thrown to pieces, and their bodies were in pain. Now it is attacked by swarms of goblin monsters. The huge cage was small and crowded, and a group of dwarves were squeezed like sardine cans, and there was no room or strength to resist. Not long after, a group of dwarves were disarmed one by one, and were taken away by the goblins with their hands tied. The dwarves were cursing, frustrated and depressed, but there was nothing they could do. Goblin monsters come and go in swarms. The dwarves were kidnapped, and the place soon became empty. A voice quickly came from the passage above the cage. Immediately afterwards, a tall figure fell from the passage into the empty cage. Boom! Morgan fell heavily into the cage. But at this moment, there were no goblin monsters around. Looking at the empty surroundings, Morgan was completely relieved. After preparing for so long, I finally stumbled and fell. Gan. Morgan let out a few long breaths, feeling depressed. Fortunately, the result is the same. After lying down for a while, I checked and realized that I had no other injuries except for some skin trauma. Morgan stood up now. Just as he walked out of the huge cage, he saw the only road in front of him. There were two monsters that were as ugly as a half-orc, and as short as a dwarf, walking towards this side. Seeing the human Morgan who had slipped through the net, he immediately waved the rusty dagger in his hand and rushed towards Morgan screaming. Morgan put away the long sword unhurriedly, and reached out to take off the long bow and arrow on his back. When the two goblin monsters rushed forward, Morgan had already drawn his bow and set up his arrows. It seems to realize that the human beings in front of them are not easy to mess with. The two goblin monsters stopped abruptly, turned around in panic and ran back. Letting these two goblins go will only lead to more goblins. Morgan would not make such a simple mistake. Loose fingers. Two arrows shot out suddenly, hitting the backs of the two goblins. The arrow was so powerful that it directly shot through the two goblins, and the arrows protruded from their chests. Morgan stepped forward quickly, reached out and pulled out the arrows from the two goblin corpses. He wiped the arrows on the two corpses again, and then reinserted them into the quiver behind him. There was no place to replenish arrows in the field. Morgan had always done that. After recovering the arrows, he kicked the two corpses down one by one to the depths of the dark pit beside him. Only then did Morgan walk forward carefully along the suspension bridge. Chapter 56. Goblin King, I am a singer. The scope of the entire underground goblin kingdom is not small. The goblins almost hollowed out the ground, and wooden suspension bridges traversed the underground kingdom in all directions. It is connected everywhere, extending in all directions, serving as the most important traffic road in the entire underground kingdom. The bottom of the suspension bridge is made up of a large number of various woods. Walking up it is wobbly, and it looks extremely poor quality, as if it may collapse at any time. The same drawbridge that Morgan is walking on now. A few thicker ropes, yes, the ropes are not chains. Several ropes are linked to each other, and pieces of wood are thrown on it. There is even an extra wooden board between the wooden boards on such a poor quality suspension bridge. Below the two sides of the suspension bridge, there is a dark cliff abyss. These abysses are huge pits that have been dug out. It was dug out by goblins for countless years. Walking on the suspension bridge, you can still hear the rhythmic knocking sound coming from afar from time to time. That's the lowest level goblins mining. This goblin kingdom is buried deep underground. It's pitch black no matter the day or night. Therefore, on both sides of a large number of suspension bridges, or on the stone walls, you can see burning oil-stained torches at intervals, or things like small stoves for lighting. Although it is far less bright than Rivendell's bright lights, it is still no problem for lighting and seeing the road. Morgan advanced cautiously with a longbow in hand. From time to time, there were noisy noises and curses in the distance. Morgan even recognized the cursing voice as that of the grumpy groin among the dwarves. Presumably at this time, the dwarves and their party should have been brought to the Goblin King by the goblins and placed under surveillance. Rescuing the dwarves wasn't Morgan's first priority. In the memory scenario, the dwarves will escape by themselves. And Gandalf, who has been away from the team for nearly a month, will also appear here to help the dwarves. Morgan's first task now was to find Bilbo, or find the monster golem. In short, if you want to get the Supreme Lord of the Rings, you must be before Bilbo. Morgan moved on. The surroundings were very quiet, the fire was burning quietly, only the old suspension bridge boards under his feet creaked as they were stepped on. The lights in the depths of the underground kingdom are brightly lit, and strange noises are heard continuously. Morgan guessed that the Goblin King should be there. The goblins caught a big fat sheep like a dwarf today. The other goblins should all be watching the fun. Morgan walked carefully across the two drawbridges. Not only was there no sign of Bilbo, nor was there a single goblin in sight. Morgan felt a little anxious and accelerated his steps. Soon, when he was about to turn a dark intersection ahead, suddenly he heard the sound of a fight. Morgan's eyes lit up, and he stepped forward cautiously. Soon, he saw a short figure in a wine-red coat holding a glowing dagger and a strong goblin of the same size fighting hard. The figure in the burgundy coat was not the Bilbo he was looking for, anyone else. Just as Morgan reached out and touched the quiver behind him quietly, ready to help Bilbo. At this moment, he saw the goblin suddenly riding on Bilbo's shoulder. The moment Bilbo tried his best to overturn the goblin on his body and fell down the abyss beside the drawbridge. Bilbo, who was already on the edge of the suspension bridge, couldn't stand still because of too much force just now, and fell backwards. Then Morgan watched as Bilbo fell down the dark depths of the mine, one after the other, following the goblin monster. Is it such a coincidence? Morgan stepped forward quickly, looking at the dark abyss below, without speaking. But thinking of the memory plot, Bilbo was in a group of goblins, and the dwarves were all captured by the goblins, so he ignored Bilbo in the crowd. And now, I just wanted to save Bilbo and take him with me. Then Bilbo might miss his encounter with the monster golem. The possibility of getting yourself the Supreme Lord of the Rings is greatly increased. But now, things seem to be perfectly back on track in the memory plot. This made Morgan a little startled thinking about it. Will it be the guidance of fate? Or is it a preordained fact that Bilbo will get the One Ring? Looking down into the dark abyss, Morgan's complexion changed a little. Soon, he made up his mind, whether it was destined or not. He's about to try. After thinking about the idea for several months, I will not give up easily because of some guesses. Thinking of this, Morgan looked left and right on the suspension bridge. He quickly found a suitable place to go down. Morgan put away his longbow, rolled up his sleeves, and began to climb down. At the same time, the heartland of the Goblin Underground Kingdom. There are suspension bridges everywhere here, and there are brightly burning torches and stoves everywhere, illuminating this underground space like daytime. At this time, the place was full of short and ugly goblins. In the center, stands a small mountain. Leaning against a small mountain peak, it is a huge suspension bridge with a length and width far exceeding other small suspension bridges. At the end of the huge suspension bridge, there is a huge and luxurious seat in front of the sharp mountain, which is studded with gold and gemstones of various colors. At this time, sitting on the seat was a super giant goblin with a height of nearly 4 meters and a huge and bloated figure. This super giant goblin holding a goat-headed skull cane and wearing a bone crown made of unknown fangs is the Goblin King of this underground kingdom. Watch the goblins below come with a pack of prey. The Goblin King was overjoyed, and he started to stand up involuntarily, shaking his pale, dirty, bloated body full of tumors and pustules, ready to sing. Seeing this, the surrounding goblins immediately began to beat the musical instruments vigorously, a huge and damaged gong, a war drum, and various iron pots and pans. In the loud and harsh percussion sound played by the goblin band, the Goblin King, who was so bloated that he needed several goblins to help him stand up, began to dance. Crack, crackle, black crack crackling. Catch it once, pull it twice, grab it and play with it. Smash it all and continue. Make them dumb. Wow wow wow. Around, around, far, underground. The Orc city is buried deep underground. The city of orcs lies deep underground, chorus of goblins. Whoosh, crackle, whip whip. Everyone loves to tell the truth when they are on my execution platform. Walking around, going around, far underground. The Orc city is buried deep underground. The city of orcs lies deep underground, chorus of goblins. Take out the hammer, raise the pliers, take the chisel and the gong. You won't live long on my fangs. Boom, clang. Clatter, clatter. Ping pong pong, it makes you tremble all over with fright. If you yell in despair, no one will come to your rescue. Walking around, going around, far underground. The Orc city is deep, buried underground. After singing the song, the Goblin King made a handsome gesture with one hand, and gritted his teeth, yet. Immediately, the bloated fat all over his body trembled violently. Chapter 57. The Lord of the Rings appears. It sounds good. After the end of the song, the bloated Goblin King stepped on the goblins who were kneeling below as cushions, sat down on the huge seat, and turned his head to look at the goblins and the caught prey in front of him. Proudly said, I created it myself. Among the goblins, the white-bearded dwarf Bahrain, who was caught by a few goblins, was really tormented by the noise just now. At this moment, he finally had the opportunity to shout out, "This is not a song, it's really terrible. There is no worse song in the world than this. Yeah, it's terrible." The dwarves immediately followed suit. "Bad, weird, different, the underground is full of them. This is my kingdom and I like it here." After finishing speaking, the Goblin King sat on his seat and waved his hand indifferently. The goblins immediately threw all the weapons seized from the dwarves in front of the Goblin King. "Look at the weapons all over the floor." The Goblin King immediately stood up with his bloated body, and his originally normal face immediately became extremely ferocious, and shouted loudly. "Who are you, dare to be fully armed and break into my kingdom? Thief, spy, or killer?" The Goblin King stared at the crowd in front of him with big cloudy eyes. It's just that the dwarves are about the same height as the goblins, and they are crowded with a large number of goblins in front of them. It's hard to tell them apart unless you look carefully. "It's a dwarf, my lord. We caught it at the entrance." At this time, a little goblin leader immediately said respectfully to the Goblin King. "Dwarf? Search them for me, and they're all gone." The Goblin King waved his hand and sat back in his seat with his bloated belly. Soon, a full bag was found by the goblins from the dwarf Ori. "Whoa whoa whoa!" The goblin poured out the bag. A piece of beautifully shaped silver spoons, wine glasses, lamp holders and other things were poured out. These things obviously belonged to the elves, and the expressions of the other dwarves changed when they saw these things, and they immediately looked at Oli. Facing his partner's eyes, Oli was a little embarrassed and said, "I just took something as a souvenir." Say, what do you want to do when you come to my place? If you don't want to say yes, bring up the meat grinder and our bone-crushing hammer, starting with the youngest dwarf. Seeing that the Goblin King was about to torture him, Soren Oakenshield, who was hiding in the crowd, finally couldn't bear it anymore. "Wait!" Thorin Oakenshield shouted loudly, pushed away the goblin beside him, walked out of the crowd, and stood in front of the bloated Goblin King. "Yo, look, look! Look who's here!" Seeing the dwarf in front of him clearly, Goblin King's eyes lit up immediately. It turned out to be Thorin, son of Thorn, grandson of Thor, king of the mountain. "Oh, sorry, I forgot, so you no longer have a mountain, and you are no longer a king. You are just a nobody now. Am I right?" The Goblin King laughed at Thorin Oakenshield in front of him with a mocking tone. After finishing speaking, without waiting for the dwarf in front of him to speak, he continued, "I suddenly remembered that someone offered a huge reward for your head. Only one head, nothing else." The Goblin King looked at Soren Oakenshield standing up straight in front of him, and continued, "Maybe you know who I'm talking about. It is your old enemy, the pale orc riding the white warg." As soon as the words fell, Thorin Oakenshield immediately raised his lowered eyelids, looked at the Goblin King in front of him and said in a deep voice, "Azog the Destroyer is dead. He died in a battle long ago." Thorin Oakenshield spoke resolutely, apparently not believing what the Goblin King said before him. "So, do you think it's impossible for him to show up again?" The Goblin King sneered and summoned the little goblin who was hanging in the air to deliver the news, and said, "Go, send a message to the Pale Orc, saying that we have caught the person he wants." Underground of the Goblin Kingdom. It was dark, damp, and smelly. A tall figure jumped off a boulder 3 meters above the ground. Standing safely on the ground, he breathed a sigh of relief. The tall figure is naturally Morgan. Climbed down where Bilbo fell. Morgan had suffered enough and was now filthy. Call. Taking a long breath, Morgan looked around. Neither Bilbo nor the goblin who was fighting Bilbo was seen. Should be around here. Thinking to himself, Morgan pulled out the elven sword on his back and started walking around to search for it. The surrounding light is dim and humid, the ground is full of various stones, uneven, and strange rocks. This huge underground pit is euphemistically called the Underground Kingdom, but it is actually a huge abandoned mine. There are all kinds of dirt in it. Morgan had only taken a few steps when he saw a colorful venomous snake on a large rock, the thickness of a thumb, but it was looking up at Morgan, spitting out letters and posing an attacking posture. Morgan didn't even think about it, he waved his hand and chopped it off with a sword. The snake head flew up immediately, and the colorful snake body curled and fell off the rock. Morgan moved on. Not long after, the corpse of a goblin monster was seen. Looking carefully, Morgan saw that it was the same one that had fought Bilbo on the drawbridge above. It's just that the goblin's body was lying on the ground in an irregular and distorted posture at this time, and ants and spiders were also crawling on the body, and it was obvious that it had been dead for a long time. After identifying the body, Morgan left immediately. After searching a large circle around the goblin's corpse, Bilbo still couldn't be seen. Morgan felt a little anxious. The speed he just came down is not too slow. As soon as Bilbo fell, he climbed down from the nearby drawbridge. The neighborhood has been searched all over, and the goblin's body was also found. If Bilbo had been knocked unconscious, he should have found it by now. Unless he was conscious when he fell, and he shouldn't have suffered any injuries. This way we can get out of here quickly. Thinking of this, Morgan couldn't stand it anymore. If he delays here for an extra minute, Bilbo is likely to get the Lord of the Rings 1 minute earlier. But which direction will Bilbo choose to go? Thinking of this, Morgan immediately looked up and looked around. Soon, after confirming that the light in one direction is slightly brighter, Morgan decisively chose to go in that direction. Bilbo is just an ordinary person, in such a dark and harsh environment. It is instinct to yearn for a bright environment. Morgan walked forward carefully with the elf sword in hand. It didn't take long for the surrounding light to become significantly brighter. Morgan moved on. Because he knew that there was a monster named Gilua below, Morgan walked very lightly. In addition, the underground environment is humid, and there are large patches of brown mushrooms growing on the ground. Morgan quietly stepped forward on the mushroom. The ambient light gradually brightens. At this moment, he suddenly heard movement not far ahead. Morgan looked happy, and immediately speeded up, and his movements became more cautious. Finally, he arrived at the place where the noise came from. Morgan carefully hit on a boulder and looked ahead. Seeing this, Morgan was stunned. He saw Bilbo in a dirty burgundy coat, with a glowing short sword in one hand. The other hand was picking up a golden ring from the ground. Chapter 58. Metamorphosis. That's the Lord of the Rings. Morgan, who was hiding behind the boulder, saw the golden ring that Bilbo picked up from the ground with his own eyes. His eyes were almost glowing, and his breathing immediately became a little short. Hoo-hoo. The Lord of the Rings, the supreme Lord of the Rings that can make you invisible and allow you to master endless and powerful power. As long as you have it, let alone the female elf of Rivendell, even the whole Middle-earth world is your own. Look, the supreme Lord of the Rings is right in front of you, isn't it the Lord of the Rings that you have always wanted? There it is, as long as you kill Bilbo, the ring is yours. Just one arrow, aimed at Bilbo's head. Kill Bilbo. The supreme Lord of the Rings will always be yours. At this moment, Morgan's head was filled with an extremely seductive voice constantly telling himself. With shortness of breath and red eyes, Morgan trembled and slowly reached out to touch the quiver on his back. Finally, he drew an arrow. With trembling hands, he slowly placed the arrow on the longbow. Morgan, eyes red, began to aim his longbow at Bilbo. Ma-teng. At this moment, an extremely stern and familiar voice suddenly sounded in Morgan's head. Ma-teng, wake up! Ma-teng, wake up! Ma-teng, this name is so familiar. At this moment, Morgan, who was confused and chaotic in his mind, finally began to think of something. Who is Ma-teng? Isn't Ma-teng just me? I am Ma-teng. In an instant, Morgan's originally red eyes suddenly became extremely clear. Morgan, who regained his sanity in an instant, saw the act of aiming at Bilbo with his longbow, and felt a chill down his back for an instant. What's wrong with yourself? What are you doing? Morgan, who loosened the bowstring as quickly as possible and put away the longbow and arrows, felt incredible at first. How could he raise his bow to aim at Bilbo? After that, Morgan only felt cold all over his body, which was extremely frightening. He clearly heard a voice in his mind just now, and that voice was telling him what to do. At that time, he was like a puppet on a string. He did what the other party said, and he couldn't refuse at all. Fortunately, there was the voice behind, and the voice called out his original name several times harshly. This made him wake up in an instant. Morgan could still remember that the two voices seemed to be his own, but the purpose of the two voices was very different. Why is that? Why does this happen? Morgan, who was fully awake, knew very clearly that everything just now was definitely not a dream, let alone his own fantasy. Fantastic experience over the past few months. At this time, Morgan's vision, and knowledge have already surpassed before. Especially now that he possesses a strength that far surpasses that of the past, he never believes that he will dream in such a dangerous environment during the day. What's more, I almost shot Bilbo with a bow just now, so can it be simply a dream? Unless there is something that confuses and tempts me. Thinking of this quickly, Morgan looked up and looked not far away. Bilbo, who was wearing a burgundy coat that was so dirty that he didn't look good, was carefully observing the golden ring he picked up. Suddenly, there seemed to be a flash of lightning in Morgan's mind. It's the Lord of the Rings. It must be the Supreme Lord of the Rings. In an instant, Morgan's azure blue eyes became extremely clear. The Supreme Lord of the Rings in the memory plot is best at bewitching, seducing, and degrading all creatures that get it. When the Lord of the Rings felt that he didn't need the other party, he would mercilessly abandon the creature that got it. This is a very evil Lord of the Rings. It has only one real master, Sauron, the most powerful Dark Lord in Middle-earth who forged it. And it can only be Sauron forever. After figuring all this out, Morgan just felt that it was completely wrong to want to improve his spiritual attributes to fight against and finally possess the Supreme Lord of the Rings. At this moment, Morgan only felt that his mind became extremely clear, and his whole body became more relaxed than ever. After taking a long breath, Morgan looked at Bilbo not far away and finally said, "Bilbo." Bilbo, who was staring at the Lord of the Rings in his hand, was startled, and subconsciously wanted to hide the Lord of the Rings behind him. But seeing Morgan coming from behind the boulder with a relaxed expression, he smiled with a little concern on his face and said, "Finally found you, are you all right?" "Fine." Bilbo laughed and shook his head at once, realizing that Morgan cared about him, and had always been that way all along, and had saved his life not so long ago. As for myself, after picking up a ring and avoiding the other party, I immediately felt very ashamed. So Bilbo took out the ring. "I just came down late, just when I saw you, you fell down with that monster, so I found it. As long as you are fine, let's go, we should go to Thorin and the others." "Hey, what are you?" As Morgan spoke, he approached Bilbo, only to see Bilbo let go of his hand, revealing the golden magic ring on his palm. "This is what I just picked up, maybe you can use it." Bilbo smiled and said, his originally tense mood immediately relaxed a lot. After meeting Morgan, he was finally safe now. "It's just a ring, how can I use it? You take it yourself." Morgan's eyes inevitably fell on Bilbo's palm, the golden shining Lord of the Rings exuding infinite charm and temptation. But at this moment, Morgan's eyes were extremely clear and deep. After he glanced at it indifferently, he pushed Bilbo's little hand back and suppressed the figure of the Lord of the Rings in his palm. "Okay." Seeing that Morgan didn't accept it, Bilbo felt more and more ashamed. He picked up the ring and put it in his coat pocket. "It's okay, we should go to Thorin. Do you know where they went?" Morgan patted Bilbo on the shoulder and asked calmly. They have all been captured by those monsters. I hid aside, and those monsters didn't find me. But there are too many monsters, I really couldn't save them at the time." Hearing Morgan ask this, Bilbo immediately explained nervously. It's not that he doesn't want to save Thorin Oakenshield and the others, but because of his limited ability, he really can't save them. "Okay, you don't need to say it, I understand. Let's find a way to get out of here now." Morgan patted Bilbo on the shoulder again and smiled, and began to look around after speaking. "I don't know how to get out of here, but there must be something else." Hearing Morgan's words, Bilbo suddenly whispered, and pointed to the intersection beside him. Chapter 59. Giloo. Oh! Looking at Bilbo, Morgan understood almost instantly. Bilbo must have seen the monster golem. In the memory plot, it seems that when the grunt was fighting with the goblin who fell down but failed to die, the Supreme Lord of the Rings fell out and Bilbo picked it up. The current situation is not the same as the plot. The goblin monster that fell with Bilbo hit the boulder and died. The monster Giloo did not appear where it fell. However, the Lord of the Rings still fell, and it happened to be picked up by Bilbo. It just shows that the Lord of the Rings voluntarily abandoned the grunt and chose to fall into Bilbo's embrace. But just now the Lord of the Rings was actively seducing him, and he almost succeeded in seducing him. After successfully resisting the temptation of the Lord of the Rings, it actually borrowed Bilbo's hand to give itself, so that it could have the Lord of the Rings openly without killing Bilbo. Does this mean that the Supreme Lord of the Rings appeared after he appeared? Compared with Bilbo, the Lord of the Rings obviously wants to be its temporary master. At this moment, Morgan understood that the Supreme Lord of the Rings seemed to have chosen him. Damn it, you can't be hard, but soft. It's so perfect. Call. Morgan let out a long breath. He has now fully understood, for sure, the Supreme Lord of the Rings in Bilbo's pocket at this time. It is definitely not a dead thing that only passively exudes temptation. But it must be the kind of magical evil existence with self-awareness. It can be seen from the fact that it can choose its own host. Morgan. Seeing that Morgan was distracted, Bilbo waved his hand in front of Morgan's eyes. Sorry, I remembered something. Bilbo, do you mean there are other things here? Morgan quickly recovered, smiled, and immediately answered the question. Yes, I just saw that. Bilbo nodded affirmatively. Presently Bilbo led the way. Morgan followed behind, casually took the longbow from his back, and drew an arrow. Crossing the rocky intersection, Bilbo took Morgan and hid behind a boulder. I just saw that monster come out of it, Bilbo whispered. Morgan nodded, and the two poked their heads out and looked around. Nearby is a group of chaotic rocks, with huge black stones everywhere. Not far ahead, there is a huge pond. No, the pond is not suitable. Such an estimate should be considered a small lake. Although it is known that this is the accumulated water at the bottom of this huge mine. But I don't know how many years it took to accumulate such a lake. Since Morgan's mental attributes were strengthened last time, his eyesight has improved a lot. Soon, he saw, in the middle of the lake in front of him, on one of the huge boulders protruding from the water, a thin and small figure was squatting on the boulder and busy with something. Turning his head to look at Bilbo, who was still looking left and right, Morgan motioned, "There." Bilbo looked over quickly, and when he saw the figure in the distance, he immediately said, "That's it." However, it is so far away from us, how can we make it speak? Bilbo withdrew his head, turned to Morgan and said. Morgan didn't speak, but just retracted his body behind the boulder, and then stepped hard on the gravel on the ground with his feet. Click! No matter how small the sound is, it will appear very loud in such a quiet environment. Okay. Morgan finished stomping, and replied to Bilbo. That's it. Bilbo looked at Morgan, and though he said nothing, Morgan could guess what he meant. If you don't believe me, take another look. Morgan spoke softly, and first put away the longbow and arrows in his hand, and then drew out the elf sword. Bilbo was a little disbelieving, and couldn't help poking his head out to look in the direction of the monster. Sure enough, there was nothing on that boulder. He is here. Bilbo asked hastily, turning his head. Morgan gestured to him, "Hush! Keep your voice down, don't scare it away." Bilbo nodded quickly, thinking that luckily he met Morgan, otherwise he would not be able to deal with that monster. Bilbo obediently shrank behind the boulder without saying a word. Morgan leaned against the boulder, closed his eyes and waited quietly. Last time in Rivendell, he continuously strengthened his spiritual attributes to LV3. Although he couldn't resist the temptation of the Supreme Lord of the Rings, it improved his 5 senses a lot. As with sight, so it is with hearing. Time passed slowly. Bilbo, who was hiding behind the boulder, began to feel a little uncomfortable. But Morgan could clearly hear a very light footstep approaching the boulder. Here comes the monster. Morgan slowly opened his eyes, and tried his best to listen to the monster's footsteps. Near the boulder. Climb up the boulder. Listen to the footsteps of the other party. Morgan stood up abruptly. Then he saw on the boulder, a skin as pale as a corpse, a rag wrapped around the crotch, thin, stooped, bald, and a small monster with a pair of terrifying protruding big eyes was staring blankly. Looking at him. Morgan saw doubts in the eyes of the monster Gillu. But he didn't like to be a teacher. As soon as he raised his hand, the elf sword fell on the shoulder of the monster Gillu. Gillu trembled all over, looked sideways at the long sword on his shoulder, and immediately uttered in horror, "The sword of the elf." Speaking of Gillu, he wanted to back away, but Morgan immediately pressed down on the long sword in his hand. The sharp blade immediately cut the skin on Gillu's shoulder, and bright red blood flowed out quickly. "Don't move, or I won't guarantee that I can control the sword in my hand." Morgan opened his mouth coldly, and the monster Gillu stopped immediately, with a look of fear on his face, and he kept muttering, "Gillu doesn't move, Gillu must not move. Tell me, how to get out here." Morgan continued to speak in a cold voice, but he knew that this monster was extremely cunning, and he would only be afraid if it was hard for him. "Over there, shut up, it's over there. It's over there." Gillu pointed in one direction, looked at Morgan with flattering eyes and said. "If this is an ordinary person, looking at Gyulu's pitiful and watery eyes, it is very likely that he will be deceived by the other party for the first time. But Morgan, who has the memory of the plot, knows very well that Gyulu's big eyes look extremely pitiful when he is flattering, and they also look extremely cruel and terrifying when he does evil. And just now this guy seemed a little confused and was talking to himself, but he wasn't sick. Rather, there are two personalities hidden in his body, one is cruel and cunning on the surface, and the other is cowardly and kind. Morgan estimated that the first one to speak just now should be the cowardly personality in him. But the monster in front of him clearly pointed in another direction. If it was someone else, he would definitely be fooled by him if he didn't pay attention. But when it comes to Morgan, it doesn't work. Morgan didn't bother to talk nonsense. He took a step forward and grabbed the monster Gyulu by the neck. He said coldly, "The exit is over there. If it's right, I'll let you go. But if it's wrong..." Before Morgan finished speaking, Gyulu immediately pointed in the opposite direction and screamed, "I misremembered, it's over there, over there." Gyulu swears. Keek. Chapter 60. Come to help. Cough cough. The exit is over there, Gollum swears. Gyulu tried his best to break Morgan's big hand around his neck with both hands, and screamed as hard as he could. Morgan snorted coldly, knowing that this monster would be dishonest. Bilbo watched Morgan go from attracting the monster to holding the monster, asking for directions, knowing that he had been cheated, and then directly asking again. This series of actions can be described as dumbfounded. If it were him, he would definitely not be able to be as crisp as Morgan. And the monster in front of him is also extremely cunning. If he hadn't met Morgan today, he would definitely be in big trouble. Walk. Morgan nodded this time, turned his head to look at Bilbo, and walked in the direction the monster in his hand said as he spoke. For the monster grunt on hand. Because it involves the later, that is, 60 years later, the Middle-earth plot of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, this monster has a lot of roles. Without special circumstances, Morgan didn't want to kill the monster. After experiencing the scene where he was almost tempted and controlled by the Supreme Lord of the Rings, Morgan became calmer and more cautious. Before that, because the speed of system enhancement was too fast, Morgan couldn't help feeling a little giddy. Then the One Ring hit him hard. Let Morgan realize very clearly that this world is far more dangerous than he imagined. With his strength, he is far from qualified to be able to float. From now on, don't underestimate any character in the plot. This is the experience and lesson that Morgan has learned. At the same time, he also paid more and more attention to the plot trend in his memory. Even if the plot has changed to a certain extent. But he found that it was a change in the branch plot, and in the overall direction, the plot did not change much. This is also his biggest survival guarantee in this world besides the system. So, for the monster in his hand that he could crush to death at any time, Morgan didn't have much intention to kill, because he didn't want to change the plot easily. However, if the monster Gyulu in his hand dies, Morgan would never mind giving it a ride. He is unwilling to change the plot. But it does not mean that he will wrong himself for the plot. Cough cough. Gollum can't breathe. Morgan strode on among the stones, Bilbo close behind. The monster Gyulu continued to use both hands to break Morgan's big hand tightly around its neck, while screaming in a high-pitched voice. Morgan just glanced at the monster in his hand coldly, didn't say anything, and the strength in his hand didn't change at all. With his control, he naturally knew how much force to use to make the monster suffocate, but not to die. There are two personalities hidden in the body of this monster. A kind cowardly. A vicious and murderous one. Kindness and cowardice are naturally no match for evil and cruelty. Therefore, it is basically the evil and brutal personality that usually occupies the dominant position. For such an evil thing, lying is not a skill at all, but an instinct when he opens his mouth. Therefore, Morgan wouldn't believe a single hair of this monster's normal condition. Although this guy seems to be bald, he still has a few ridiculous hairs. Cough cough. Gyulu really can't breathe. Gyulu is so uncomfortable. The monster Gyulu continued to pretend to be miserable. Morgan was upset and shouted coldly, "Shut up! If I find a way out, I will let you go. No more nonsense, you don't have to go back." Morgan grinned, exposing Sun Yan's white teeth, and said harshly. As soon as the voice fell, sure enough, the monster Gyulu immediately shut up, although a pair of big watery eyes were still spinning around. For this kind of bad guy, you have to be more ruthless than him to deal with them. Did you know Bilbo? Morgan suddenly spoke, and said to Bilbo who was on the side. Bilbo, who was closely following Morgan, reacted immediately, nodded quickly and said, "Yes, I understand." As if feeling a little prolific in his answer, Bilbo immediately added, "I know now." Bilbo was really not being perfunctory, he was really enlightened. From luring the monster over, to dealing with the monster docilely. If it were the other dwarves in the expedition team, they might have gone down with an axe or a hammer. Nor did Morgan care whether Bilbo was listening or not. Start from the moment you break free from the temptation of the Supreme Lord of the Rings. His whole person has changed a lot. The monster Giluz said the right direction this time. Not long after the two of them walked, they saw a significantly wider road in the distance ahead. Although still a trail. But consider that this is an underground kingdom of goblin monsters. This way is normal. Now that he found the right path, Morgan didn't lie. Throwing aside the monster Giluz in his hand, he said coldly, "Get lost." Gollum rolled on the ground, stretched out his hand and desperately rubbed the red neck that had been deeply imprinted by Morgan, stared at Morgan and Bilbo with big vicious eyes, and kept talking to himself. Morgan ignored the monster and walked straight forward with the elf sword in hand. Bilbo was behind, and turned his head to look at the Gollum monster behind him. He was startled when he saw the vicious look on his face, and hurried to catch up with Morgan. Not long after Morgan and Bilbo had left. Suddenly there was an incomparably shrill scream from among the rocks behind him, "No, no! No, my baby! My baby is lost! Who stole my baby? Thief, thief! You two despicable thieves!" The central area of the underground kingdom is brightly lit. A large meat grinder, a giant bone crusher was slowly transported to the giant suspension bridge in the center of the kingdom. At the end of the drawbridge, 13 dwarves were besieged by goblins. The goblins and musicians around beat their simple instruments desperately. The gigantic, bloated Goblin King rocked his disgusting fat body again for his one-man concert performance. "Break your bones! Break your neck! Hanging to the gallows! You will die here! Never see the sun! In this deep orc city!" The bloated Goblin King sang and danced. The little goblin on the side was inspecting the weapons seized from the dwarves. Yi picked up a delicately shaped dagger, and just as he pulled out the blade, he suddenly threw the dagger far away, trembling all over. This throw was even more unfortunate, it happened to be thrown at the feet of the dancing Goblin King. Looking at the half of the elf sword with its scabbard exposed, the Goblin King was frightened and backed away again and again, and finally fell to the ground with a bang. With the help of several little goblins beside him, the Goblin King curled up on the seat and pointed at the elf dagger on the ground and shouted, "I know that sword! That sword once killed 1,000 orcs. Kill the dwarves, flog them, leave none." The frightened goblin pointed at the trapped dwarves and shouted angrily. Next second, a large number of goblins immediately screamed and swung their weapons at the unarmed dwarves. Being tied up and without weapons, the dwarves were about to be burped. At this time, a dazzling white light suddenly exploded on the passage not far away, and the violent magic energy quickly swept across the entire suspension bridge. All the affected goblin dwarves and even the Goblin King were overthrown to the ground. The scene was silent for a while. Chapter 61. A close call. The dazzling white light quickly dissipated. Immediately afterwards, a tall figure wearing a pointed hat and a grey robe, holding a staff in one hand, and an elf sword in the other suddenly appeared in everyone's eyes. The one who came was naturally the wizard Gandalf. After nearly a month of separation from everyone in Rivendell, the capital of elves, Gandalf finally caught up with the expedition and appeared at such a critical moment of danger. Looking at the goblin monsters and dwarves who fell to the ground in front of them, Gandalf looked at the fallen dwarves and yelled, "Get up! Take up arms! Fighting!" At this moment, Gandalf's magic-blessed voice sounded like the most shocking bell, suddenly ringing in the minds of the fallen dwarves. "Let the dwarves wake up immediately." The ropes tied to the dwarves by the goblins who were originally self-sustaining in large numbers were not so careful. "I have been struggling by the dwarves before, and I have just experienced some tearing, and now Gandalf has used magic to do this." At this time, the rope trapped on the dwarves seemed to be in vain, and the dwarf who stood up immediately struggled away. The dwarves quickly recovered and got up, and immediately rushed to the side of the weapons confiscated by the goblins. The goblin monster's reaction was not slow either. After the dwarf got up quickly, he quickly got up from the ground. The dwarf filly was the fastest. He jumped onto the weapon pile, quickly picked up the weapon and threw it at the dwarves. Keely! Bomber! Dolly! After breaking free from the binding ropes, the weapons that belonged to him returned to the hands of the dwarves. The fighting power of the dwarves increased immediately. Armed with weapons, the dwarves have nothing to fear from these goblin monsters. The two sides quickly fought into one group in a short period of time, and the battle situation became fierce in an instant. On the wide suspension bridge. At this time, the wizard Gandalf is the most popular. A cane in one hand and an elf sword in the other. Gandalf shot left and right, and all the goblin monsters in front of him basically couldn't make it through the second round. Coupled with his tall stature, Gandalf is extremely conspicuous on the drawbridge battlefield. Apart from Gandalf, Thorin Oakenshield was also very powerful. After Gandalf's magic attack, he was the fastest to react. A donkey rolled on the spot, and quickly rushed to the elf sword thrown away by the goblin monsters. Picking up the sword, he raised his hand and stabbed a goblin monster in the stomach. Thorin Oakenshield, who had just escaped from the humiliation of the Goblin King, finally got a chance to vent his anger. In addition, this elf sword, which is famous for killing half-orcs, seems to have a damage bonus to goblins. Thorin Oakenshield stabbed the first goblin to death, and immediately rushed to the other one beside him. The young dwarves in the Lonely Mountain expedition are the young outstanding ones of the Turin dwarves who now live in the Blue Mountains, like Keely and Philly. The older dwarves have experienced the Battle of the Lonely Mountain of Smaug the Dragon, the Battle of the Mine of Moria, and many other wars that resounded throughout the Middle-earth world. They are the elite of the elite, like Whitebeard Balin, German Valen et.al. In addition, the new dwarf king, Thorin Oakenshield, who has been tested and recognized by all Turin dwarves. And there is Gandalf, the melee wizard who is famous throughout Middle-earth. The goblins on the giant suspension bridge were quickly killed. It's just that the location of the expedition team at this time is the central area of the entire underground goblin kingdom. This underground kingdom lacks everything: lack of food, lack of weapons and armor, lack of various resources. But there is no shortage of evil goblin monsters. A group had just been killed on the suspension bridge, before the expedition team could catch their breath. A large number, countless goblin monsters rushed from the suspension bridge, under the suspension bridge, and from all directions to the giant suspension bridge in the center of the underground kingdom like dense swarms of ants. No matter how elite and strong the expedition team is, they will definitely not be able to withstand such a long-term and high-intensity fight. Fortunately, the space of this giant suspension bridge is not too large. After crowding more than a dozen people from the expedition team and a certain number of goblin monsters, the other goblins can only wait outside screaming and worrying. Can't squeeze in at all. But even so, the goblins who had just swarmed up in the second wave were killed back. A group of dwarves began to feel tired. Think about it too, half a day ago. The expedition team had just escaped from the battle of the stone giants as towering as mountains, and was exhausted. After finally finding a cave to rest, unexpectedly fell into the trap of goblin monsters. Before everyone had time to rest and recuperate, they were captured by goblin monsters and became captives. After being tormented by the goblin monsters, he finally waited for Gandalf to arrive. Now they are fighting back 2 waves of attacks from a huge group of goblins. Such a series of high-intensity experiences, even hard-working fighters would not be able to bear it. Gandalf, there are too many monsters here, I think we should go. Balin, the white-bearded dwarf, stabbed the goblin in front of him with a sword, approached Gandalf with blood on his face and said loudly, "It's time to go. We can't kill these monsters alone. By the way, why didn't you see Morgan?" Gandalf nodded and asked after hitting a goblin's head with a stick. "Morgan? I didn't see him. We didn't see Morgan the first time we were surrounded. With Morgan's bow and arrow skills, maybe Morgan has already escaped." "Impossible. There are so many monsters in this dungeon. No matter how strong Morgan is, he still doesn't have enough arrows." Listening to Gandalf asking about Morgan, the dwarves were fighting against the goblin monsters, while answering each other loudly. "Forget about Morgan, there are more and more monsters here, and it will be difficult for us to leave if we don't leave. Let's go, get out of here first, and then follow me." As Gandalf said, he slashed to death the goblin who rushed forward with his sword, and immediately waved his hand to signal to the surrounding dwarves. The dwarves immediately approached Gandalf, and a group of people immediately rushed to the outside of the giant suspension bridge. Thorin Oakenshield, who was a little further away, obviously didn't notice the departure of the surrounding partners because he was too involved in the fight. A group of dwarves also failed to notice the absence of Thorin Oakenshield because of the goblin monsters swarming around. The expedition team headed by Gandalf quickly rushed to the outside of the giant suspension bridge. Not long after, Whitebeard Balin suddenly realized that Sorin was not in the team, and immediately shouted, "Wait, Sorin hasn't caught up yet." His opening immediately attracted the attention of the entire team. Gandalf immediately stopped advancing, and it was only then that the other dwarves realized that Thorin Oakenshield was missing. "There, I see Thorin, he's trapped." Balin, who was the first to notice that Sorin hadn't followed, pointed to the huge suspension bridge behind him and shouted loudly. Everyone looked carefully, only to find that Sorin was indeed surrounded by 3 layers of goblin monsters. "Quick, Thorin needs our help!" Gandalf cried out, and turned at once. The dwarves all saw the danger Thorin was facing, and immediately followed Gandalf and went back to kill again. The situation is critical. Faced with such a large number of goblin monsters, once you are alone and surrounded, you will have to wait for death. What's more, the Goblin King said it before. Thorin was offered a bounty by Azog, an orc riding a white warg. Sorin, who is alone now, is the fattest piece of meat for all goblins. Kill him. Chop off his head. The supergiant and bloated Goblin King with a stature close to 4 meters pointed at Sorin Oakenshield, who was exhausted from fighting, grinning and roaring. With the Goblin King at the side, all the goblin monsters rushed towards Thorin Oakenshield with great fanaticism. Goblin monsters are gathering more and more, and the expedition team led by Gandalf is easy to kill, but it is extremely slow and difficult to kill back. Seeing that Thorin Oakenshield began to lose his strength, his movements became slower and slower. The bloated Goblin King on the side laughed more and more wildly. The expedition team couldn't see Sorin who was besieged, but they could clearly see the expression of the giant Goblin King. The group became more and more impatient, but there was nothing they could do. Time passed slowly, and Thorin Oakenshield moved more and more slowly, with more and more wounds on his body. Finally, Thorin Oakenshield couldn't hold on and fell to the ground. The Goblin King immediately roared, and all the goblins stopped. The Goblin King stepped forward with a smirk, looked at the powerless Sorin Oakenshield who fell to the ground, and waved his hand to snatch the rusty axe from a little goblin's hand, raised his hand and chopped off Sorin Oakenshield's head. The members of the expedition team who were getting closer finally saw this scene, and shouted, "No!" Chapter 62. Out of the Dungeon 1. No! Shorin! Shorin! Do not! All the members of the expedition team looked helplessly at this scene in the distance, all of them shouted angrily with red eyes. The Goblin King turned a deaf ear and looked at Sorin Oakenshield, who fell powerlessly in front of him, as if he saw a large golden bounty and waved to himself, raised his hand with a grinning grin, and cut off Sorin Oakenshield's head without hesitation. At this moment, at the critical moment, whoosh! An arrow shot out with the sound of piercing through the air. Next second, wielding a small rusty axe, the extremely large and bloated Goblin King suddenly shook, as if he had been frozen, and remained motionless. Immediately afterwards, the Goblin King's ugly, fat face immediately showed a strange expression, which was a rich expression that integrated anger, shock, and horror. The Goblin King slowly turned his head and twisted his face to look to the left. Not far from the left, on the edge of the giant suspension bridge, 2 figures, one tall and one short, suddenly appeared. The tall one is obviously a human, holding a longbow in his hand. The short one is a hobbit, holding a very short sword in his hand at this time, and his expression is a little nervous. Looking at the 2 figures that suddenly appeared, the Goblin King's ugly and distorted face seemed to have a hint of willingness to solve the doubts, and then the cloudy eyes immediately dimmed, and the entire huge body fell forward. Bang! Nearly 4 meters tall, with a huge and bloated body, it is difficult to stand up at ordinary times. The supergiant Goblin King fell to the ground with a loud bang immediately. All the goblins around looked at the Goblin King who suddenly fell to the ground, and then at the 2 uninvited guests by the suspension bridge. I still don't understand what's going on here. Kill them! Revenge for His Majesty! Kill them! Kill them! Realizing that their king had been killed, the goblins who reacted immediately burst into incomparable anger. At this time, no one cared about the fallen Thorin Oakenshield, and almost all the goblin monsters rushed towards the 2 uninvited guests by the suspension bridge angrily. In the expedition team not far away, it was the opposite of all the goblins, full of joy. Seeing Sorin about to die under the Goblin King's axe, the members who were extremely worried and anxious saw Morgan and Bilbo emerge, and then the Goblin King fell down, and they also reacted immediately over here. Although they couldn't see exactly what happened. But Morgan has shot and killed 3 giant rock trolls, and he still has the title of Troll Butcher. For Morgan, who is extremely good at archery, killing one more Goblin King didn't seem to be a difficult task. The Goblin King who suddenly fell to the ground in front of him is the truth. Morgan must have shot the Goblin King. This is the thought in the hearts of all expedition members at this moment. Seeing that the Goblin King was killed, a large number of goblin monsters rushed towards Morgan and Bilbo madly. Even the number of goblins who besieged their large team had decreased a lot. Gandalf immediately made a decisive decision. Quick, let's save Thorin first. Quick! A group of dwarves knew that Morgan shot and killed the Goblin King, although they wanted to vomit in their hearts. But everyone knew that the situation was critical at this time, and no one dared to talk nonsense, and immediately followed Gandalf to the direction where Thorin Oakenshield was. The huge suspension bridge was full of screaming and angry goblin monsters. It was extremely chaotic and crowded. On the battlefield of the entire underground kingdom, except for Morgan and Bilbo who knew exactly what happened just now. Soren Oakenshield is the clearest one. Soren Oakenshield, who originally thought he would die here, almost from the beginning to the end, from the moment when the Goblin King raised his axe and slashed at him, until he finally fell to the ground and died. Thorin Oakenshield could see everything clearly. It was an arrow that killed the Goblin King. An arrow that almost completely sank into the Goblin King's eyes. If it weren't for seeing a small cluster of white tail feathers protruding from the big eyeballs of the Goblin King, I'm afraid that even I, who is far away, don't know what happened. It just so happened that Soren Oakenshield, the arrow with tail feathers, was quite familiar. Because that was the arrow that Morgan, the bounty hunter with the most outstanding archery skills in his expedition, commonly used. He has seen it a few times and is fairly familiar with it. It was Morgan who saved me. Realizing Morgan's arrival, Thorin Oakenshield, who had almost been waiting to die, immediately regained his fighting spirit. As long as there is hope, no one wants to die. What's more, he was burdened with blood feud and great plan to restore the country. So, at the moment when the bloated Goblin King fell down, Thorin's Oakenshield flexibly dodged the opponent's huge body. He didn't move rashly, and then saw all the goblins around rushing to the side angrily. Soren Oakenshield turned over and stood up, and rushed to the side. As soon as he got up, the goblin monsters immediately noticed him again. The surrounding goblins immediately surrounded him. Shorin! Shorin! Soren, where are you? At this moment, the expedition team finally reached the end of the giant suspension bridge, and all the members immediately shouted. I am here. Thorin Oakenshield cut off half of the head of the goblin monster in front of him with a sword and roared. Quick, Thorin is there. Keely, the dwarf, finally saw his uncle Thorin Oakenshield intact not far away, and couldn't help shouting. Great, Thorin is all right. Let me just say, it's not so easy for Thorin to have an accident. Thanks to Morgan, if it wasn't for him. Yes, Morgan. Help Morgan. Seeing that although Thorin Oakenshield was in a bit of a mess, he looked okay, and the dwarves who had just killed him were overjoyed. Just talking, he immediately remembered Morgan who had just shot the Goblin King and was targeted by all the goblin monsters. All the dwarves were worried and anxious again. Hearing everyone talking about Teacher Morgan, the dwarf Keely cut down the goblin monster in front of him with a sword and looked around, and soon saw 2 figures surrounded by goblin monsters in the distance. Morgan is over there. I saw Bilbo, too. No, they are in danger. We're going to rescue them. Keely pointed to the distance and shouted, and the other members of the expedition immediately looked over. No, we can't all go through. As soon as Gandalf raised his hand, a dazzling white light erupted from the top of the staff, knocking all the surrounding goblin monsters into the air. Gandalf took the opportunity to turn around and said quickly, Now, Bahrain, you take Philip Pond, Valindo and their brothers to rescue Thorin. I'll take the others to save Morgan and Bilbo. Go over there, see, there. Let's gather there, hurry up. Gandalf pointed to the large drawbridge in the distance and spoke quickly. Balin nodded quickly. Soon, the expedition team split into 2 groups and headed towards the raging group of goblins. Chapter 63. Out of the Dungeon 2. Kill them. Revenge for His Majesty. Kill them. The dense crowd of goblins screamed strangely and rushed towards Morgan and Bilbo crazily. Fortunately, this underground kingdom built a suspension bridge. As long as Morgan kills the suspension bridge, he won't worry about being surrounded by goblin monsters countless times like the two of them. Because almost all suspension bridges are lined with deep abysses. Plus the limited width on the drawbridge. A large number of fanatical goblin monsters fell into the abyss on both sides because of being crowded. Or some because of the poor quality of the suspension bridge, a large number of goblin monsters flooded in at one time, resulting in a weight imbalance. The suspension bridge could not bear it and broke directly, resulting in the death of many goblin monsters. It is also because of the large number of suspension bridges built in this underground kingdom. The four links are developed and connected everywhere. No matter how fast Morgan and Bilbo were. These goblin monsters, who are far more familiar than the members of the expedition team, can always catch up to the two of them at the fastest speed. At this moment, Morgan and Bilbo were stopped by goblin monsters on a drawbridge. Morgan, are we going to die here? Bilbo stabbed the rushing goblin to death with a sword, and overturned the goblin's body with all his strength. He turned his head and looked at Morgan, who was fighting hard beside him, and asked loudly. Die here. Morgan swung his sword to cut off the rusty dagger in the hands of the goblin in front of him, split half of the goblin's body, and kicked the mutilated corpse in front of him flying, grinning back to Bilbo behind him. How is this possible? We won't die here. Dead in such an unknown place. Even if we will die vigorously. Morgan grinned ferociously, holding the elf longsword in both hands, stepped forward and suddenly accelerated, met the two goblin monsters that were rushing, and stabbed in with his sword. The elven longsword pierced the goblin monster's body without the slightest hindrance, and Morgan pierced the first goblin's body in an instant. Regardless of being slashed with a dagger by the undead goblin on the sword, Morgan continued to speed up. The second goblin didn't have time to dodge. With a frightened expression on his face, brandishing the dagger in his hand, he stabbed the goblin's body strung on the elf sword without hesitation, but it couldn't stop the elf sword from driving straight in. The elf sword instantly sank into the body of the second goblin monster, and the tip of the sword protruded from its back. A string of two. Follow. Morgan turned quickly and shouted at Bilbo. Immediately, holding swords in both hands, he rushed forward crazily with the corpses of the two goblin monsters. Bang 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 bang. Several goblin monsters standing in front of the suspension bridge were knocked over by the corpses of the two meat shields on Morgan's long sword and fell off the suspension bridge. When he rushed to the head of the suspension bridge, Morgan immediately stepped on the corpse on the sword, and pulled out the elf sword. On the long sword, the dirty and smelly black blood of goblins flowed quickly from the sharp blade to the ground. The elven longsword quickly recovered as clean as new. Morgan glanced back at Bilbo, who was staggering after him. More and more large groups of goblins are yelling and chasing after them. These goblin monsters don't know what it means to be afraid of death at all. No matter how many deaths there are, they will still rush forward one after another. Standing at the head of the suspension bridge, Morgan quickly looked around. Did not see Gandalf and the dwarves. The underground kingdom is too big, there are many suspension bridges in all directions, and at the same time, there are a large number of small peaks one after another. Slightly farther away, the line of sight is seriously affected. At this time, the entire underground kingdom was in a mess, and it was unrealistic to contact the members of the expedition team just by shouting. Goblin monsters also gathered more and more, and it was impossible to run away blindly. They would only exhaust their strength and stamina, and finally died. We still need to find Gandalf and the others first. Gandalf knows the way out. Thinking of this quickly, Morgan didn't stop on his feet, and immediately chose a direction with fewer goblin monsters to rush. Killed the huge goblin queen with an arrow earlier. Countless goblin monsters rushed up, and Morgan had no time to distinguish the direction, so he had to flee in a hurry. Where can I still take care of meeting with the rest of the expedition team? Now that the dangerous situation has just eased, Morgan has time to think about the next question. Morgan, here. At this moment, a familiar voice suddenly came from below. Morgan knocked down the goblin monster standing in front of him with a sword, and looked around with joy on his face. Here, Morgan, I'm under you. At this time, Morgan heard the voice again clearly. Morgan quickly looked down through the wide gap of the suspension bridge under his feet, and soon saw a position a little further below. Gandalf is leading the dwarf Keely Groin and other dwarves to fight with the goblin group below. Morgan on, and on. At this moment, Gandalf's cry came again from below. I see. Morgan yelled back, and immediately heard Bilbo's exclamation behind him. Morgan turned his head immediately, and saw Bilbo being thrown to the ground by a goblin monster climbing up from the bottom of the drawbridge, and a large number of chasing goblin monsters behind him were about to catch up. Immediately Morgan turned back and strode towards Bilbo. He rushed to Bilbo quickly, and looked at the goblin monster who was entangled with Bilbo to compete for strength. Morgan swung his sword and slashed, as if he didn't care if he hurt Bilbo. Bilbo, who was fighting with the stinking goblin, suddenly felt a burst of warm and smelly liquid splashing all over his face. Then he felt that the goblin monster that was pressing on him immediately stopped resisting. "Come on!" Until he heard Morgan's voice and was quickly pulled up by Morgan. Bilbo had just seen that the goblin had been decapitated by Morgan's sword, and the warm and smelly liquid that drenched his face was the blood of the goblin monster. Bilbo hastily wiped the stinking blood from his face. Morgan was not in the mood to make fun of Bilbo at this moment, so he turned his head and ran in the direction Gandalf pointed. "Ba ba ba!" Bilbo, who hurriedly followed Morgan, vomited frantically. "Over here, Morgan!" Gandalf's voice again from below. Morgan sprinted across the drawbridge, plus cleared the few goblin monsters that stood in his way. Even at such a speed, Bilbo, who is short and short-legged, still needs to run desperately to catch up with him. With Gandalf's guidance, Morgan approached quickly and purposefully in the direction of Gandalf's team. Morgan went all the way down, and after rushing through more than a dozen suspension bridges, Gandalf and a group of dwarves finally appeared a little far ahead. He turned his head and saw a large number of screaming goblin monsters chasing behind him. Morgan stood at the end of the bridge, waiting for Bilbo to rush out of the bridge. Morgan raised his hand and cut off the suspension ropes on both sides of the suspension bridge behind him. Watching a large number of goblin monsters screaming and falling directly into the abyss. Only then did Morgan turn around and stride towards Gandalf and the others. Chapter 64. Out of the Dungeon 3. He chopped down several goblin monsters standing in front of the suspension bridge in a row. Morgan greeted Bilbo behind him, lifted his feet and jumped from the suspension bridge below to a long wooden bridge built along the mountain wall below. At this time, the dwarves led by Gandalf, including Keely Groin, were in front of the wooden bridge below. Bang! With a height difference of nearly 3 meters, Morgan jumped down and sat on the head of one of the goblin monsters who were madly chasing Gandalf and his party. The goblin monster that was knocked down by Morgan fell to the ground, and blood flowed from its mouth and nose, and it remained motionless. The group of goblins were stunned when they saw this scene, and then they quickly reacted, brandishing their rusty daggers and pounced on Morgan who had fallen from the sky. At this time, bang! Another bang! A short and stocky figure descended from the sky again, and directly hit the goblin monster that rushed forward with a strange scream. Before the goblin could make a sound, Bilbo sat on the ground and died. This time, the goblin monsters did not hesitate in a daze, but rushed forward even more furiously and fiercely. Morgan swung his sword and cut off half of the goblin monster who rushed forward first, then turned around and ran away. Bilbo also took the opportunity to get up quickly, and followed closely behind Morgan. Compared with the dangerous suspension bridge, the long wooden bridge built along the mountain wall is obviously more dangerous. A large number of goblin monsters climbed down from the side of the mountain wall and climbed up from under the wooden bridge. Many goblin monsters even jumped down from other suspension bridges like Morgan Bilbo. A steady stream of goblin monsters rushed forward one after another. Morgan tirelessly repeated the movements of swinging the sword, dodging, swinging the sword again, and dodging again. Morgan didn't know how many goblin monsters he had killed this time. But thinking that killing the half-orc will gain soul power, it must be the same for killing this goblin monster. But at this time, he definitely didn't have extra thoughts and extra time to think about these things. Because of a distraction, those goblin monsters who can rush from everywhere will give him a sword or a dagger at any time. In this dungeon kingdom, in front of such a large number of goblin monsters, the 20 or 30 arrows in the quiver on Morgan's back were useless at all. The archery skill he is best at is unavailable, but luckily Morgan still has the White Crow sword skill. After raising the White Crow swordsmanship to LV2 level in Rivendell a month ago, Morgan has never relaxed his training on White Crow sword technique. Not only in the dreamlike Rivendell, but also when other members of the expedition team were enjoying relaxation, Morgan was still training unremittingly. And within nearly a month of leaving Rivendell and embarking on the journey again, Morgan's training continues to be rain or shine. Even the dwarves of the expedition laughed and said Morgan was a training madman several times. Finally, in this underground goblin kingdom, Morgan's well-trained White Crow swordsmanship finally played a vital role. If it weren't for the hard work and persistence in training this month, It is absolutely impossible for Morgan's swordsmanship to be as freely as it is now. The strength of the members of the expedition team is still very good. When encountering battles, the dwarves will consciously protect Morgan, who is an archer, from the rear and output. But inside this evil dungeon filled with countless goblin monsters, the members of the expedition were clearly overwhelmed. Just like Thorin Oakenshield before, if it wasn't because he appeared in time and shot the arrow, Thorin Oakenshield would most likely die in this dungeon today. Thorin Oakenshield, the absolute protagonist of the expedition, almost died. Morgan didn't believe he would be treated any differently. And before that, he had just shot the Goblin Queen to death, facing the countless goblin monsters that came. If it weren't for the fact that I had been insisting on training the White Crow swordsmanship before, it was absolutely difficult for Morgan to survive the attack of that wave of goblin monsters. At the moment of escaping afterwards, Morgan was extremely grateful to himself who had been training uninterruptedly before. Even so, Morgan was still covered in blood and gore, and there were several wounds of different sizes on his body. The great pain from these wounds reminded Morgan all the time. If he didn't keep his spirit up, he might die at the hands of these goblin monsters in the next moment. Quickly, Gandalf's roar came from ahead. Holding the elven longsword in his hand, Morgan slashed over the entangled goblin monsters all the way, and strode towards the expedition team members ahead. Bilbo followed Morgan, panting wildly. Morgan went all the way. Soon, on a suspension bridge diagonally below, the figures of dwarves such as Balin and Philip Bomber appeared. Among them, Thorin Oakenshield was impressively there. Originally, Morgan was a little unsure whether Thorin Oakenshield was saved because of his own arrow. Now it seems that it must be. Thorin Oakenshield and his party were also followed by a large number of goblin monsters. Now almost all the members of the expedition team are coming together. Thinking about it, Morgan immediately turned his head and glanced behind him. Countless, densely packed, far more and denser than before, goblin monsters kept rushing here from all directions, and Morgan was so frightened that he swears directly. If this is surrounded, there is absolutely no way out. Morgan immediately turned his head and ran forward as fast as he could. At this time, the goblin army gathered in the rear like an army made an extremely loud and strange cry, which became louder and louder, almost shaking the entire underground kingdom. While running wildly ahead, Gandalf and the dwarf Keely and his party couldn't help but look back. All of them looked horrified, almost no different from Morgan. Quickly, Gandalf growled. The expedition team gathered all their strength and rushed forward. Finally, at the end of the long wooden bridge below, a rocky path appeared. The suspension bridge of the underground kingdom extends in all directions, and it was also in front of this rocky path that Morgan caught up with Gandalf and his party. The dwarf squad led by Whitebeard Balin also caught up with the big team at this moment. The expedition team was finally fully reunited. At this time, a dense army of goblin monsters rushed forward like ants. The momentum is astonishing. The dwarf Dwellin smashed the goblin monster behind him to death with a hammer. Hearing the more alarming movement behind him, he couldn't help but looked back and said loudly, "There are too many of them, we can't deal with them at all." Gandalf swung his staff and knocked over a goblin in front of him, looked back quickly, and immediately said, "There is only one thing that can save us now, and that is sunlight. Follow me all." Quickly, Gandalf charged forward at the head, followed by the rest of the expedition. When the goblin army behind him was getting closer, the members of the expedition became more anxious and their faces became more serious. Finally, at the end of the curved rock path, a slightly narrow and dark stone crevice appeared. Deep in the crevices of the stone, there is a faint light coming. Chapter 65. A Comeback. The endless, dense army of goblin monsters rushed in like a tidal wave. At this moment, the entire underground kingdom was shaking and trembling. Facing the black army that is almost behind everyone, almost all the members of the expedition team were running with all their might. If it is entangled, there is only one end, and that is to be submerged in an instant, and then quickly gnawed into bones by countless goblin monsters. Quickly, Gandalf roared and took the lead to rush into the dark stone crevice. Morgan followed suit. This is not the time to be polite and humble. The army of goblin monsters at the back can make one's scalp tingle instantly at a glance. Morgan didn't have any luck in mind. It's not making a movie right now. Anyone who wants to be entangled at this time will undoubtedly die. And no one dared to save it, because it was absolutely impossible to save it. Only the army can deal with the army. The fastest are Gandalf and Morgan. Then Thorin Oakenshield and Bilbo followed closely behind them. Although Thorin Oakenshield suffered all kinds of hardships and setbacks today, the new Dwarf King's physical resilience, endurance, and willpower were equally astonishing. After recovering quickly, even with injuries all over his body, Thorin Oakenshield was still able to run ahead of all the dwarves, which was very telling. Bilbo followed closely behind Thorin Oakenshield. Bilbo, who has the aura of the protagonist, not only got the Supreme Lord of the Rings tonight, which can save his life at critical times. Although he has not been able to figure out the special ability of the ring yet. It was because of his good luck to meet Morgan that not only did he not encounter real danger in the underground kingdom, but he was also severely tempered. This is much better than Bilbo's original situation in the story of Morgan's memory. It's really a blessing, it is worthy of the treatment of the leading role with a halo. Follow Thorin Oakenshield and Bilbo. It is a group of dwarf members. Don't look at the dwarves who are short, and they are tall and thick, but they run fast. But for the goblin monsters who lived in the underground kingdom for countless years, the speed of the expedition team is really not fast. This is also the reason why the expedition team was quickly drawn closer by the army of goblin monsters behind them. If the distance was longer, the expedition team might really be doomed this time. But fortunately they have Gandalf leading the team. Along with the expedition team, the last dwarf Doli rushed into the narrow stone crevice. The army of goblin monsters following closely behind them immediately slowed down a lot. Because the narrow stone crevice can easily accommodate the expedition team, but it cannot accommodate such a large number of goblin troops. Sure enough, when the army of goblin monsters reached the entrance of the stone crevice, there was a burst of chaos. The reason is naturally because of successively entering the stone crevice passage. But at least they were able to get the edge of intelligent creatures, and the goblin monsters were only confused for a while, and then quickly returned to normal. The goblins continued to chase. But in the expedition team at this time, Gandalf and Morgan, who were running at the forefront, could already see the bright light coming from ahead. Quickly. In the narrow stone crevices, the strange cries of the goblin army behind him became more and more deafening. Close, closer. Finally, when Morgan and Gandalf rushed out of the narrow stone passage first. The bright blue sky, the lush green trees, the warm autumn sun hanging high in the sky, everything is so beautiful. The moment Morgan rushed out of the underground kingdom, he felt everything brighten up. As Morgan and Gandalf rushed out of the underground kingdom first, Thorin Oakenshield and Bilbo followed closely behind, and then a group of dwarves. In the end, the goblin monsters who were only one step away from turning those dwarves into captives of the underground kingdom could only stand densely at the entrance of the rock crevice and watch the remote team go away screaming, but there was nothing they could do. After Gandalf and Morgan rushed out of the underground kingdom first, they continued to rush down the mountain, showing no intention of stopping. Although Gandalf knew that these evil creatures who lived in the underground world for many years were almost afraid of the sun. But it's just fear and dislike, it's not that I can't see the sun. Just like half-orcs are afraid of the sun, but the dwarves in order to hunt down the expedition can still appear during the day. This time the expedition team not only killed the Goblin King, but also killed a large number of goblin monsters, turning the entire underground kingdom upside down. Even if these goblin monsters rushed out angrily, Gandalf would not be surprised. Fortunately, when the expedition team rushed out of the underground kingdom on the mountain and ran all the way down the mountain for half an hour. After they did not see the goblin monsters behind them, nor heard their voices, the speed of the expedition team began to slow down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 9. Panting heavily, Gandalf began to count with the staff in his hand. Oin, Bomber 10, 11, Dolly, Bomber, 10-23. Bilbo, Morgan. 14, 15. Why are there only 15, who is missing? Gandalf looked left and right, and seemed to find that everyone was there, but there was obviously one missing from the 16-member expedition team he remembered before, panting heavily and wondering. Forget about yourself. This is the second time, Gandalf. At this moment, Morgan walked up to Gandalf and said with a smile. Look at my memory. Gandalf suddenly realized, shook his head and smiled. Long time no see, Gandalf. Morgan stepped forward and gave Gandalf a hug. You came just in time. Morgan spoke softly, this trip to the underground goblin kingdom touched Morgan too deeply. Not only because after being tempted by the Supreme Lord of the Rings, he resisted the temptation and let him see something clearly. It also made Morgan feel that it is great to have a group of reliable and trustworthy partners. In the underground kingdom before, when he shot the Goblin Queen to death and was surrounded by countless goblin monsters, he once thought that he would die there. Fortunately, he finally succeeded in breaking out of the dungeon alive. "We're partners, aren't we?" Gandalf patted Morgan on the shoulder and smiled. Looking at the human Morgan in front of him, Gandalf felt very relieved. There is no need to say much about Morgan's excellent performance along the way. At the critical moment in the underground kingdom behind him, the fact that Morgan shot the Goblin King to death and saved Soren Oakenshield was even more important. Gandalf felt that he had done the right thing in bringing Morgan into the expedition. Even if he had thought about it more than once. Of course. Morgan nodded with a smile. At this time, Soren Oakenshield, who was tired but energetic, came over, looked at Morgan and said solemnly, "Morgan, thank you for that arrow, it saved me." His noble bloodline and illustrious birth made Thorin Oakenshield extremely proud and stubborn since he was a child. But he is definitely not a person who doesn't know what to do. The extremely thrilling scene of the underground kingdom behind him, if it weren't for Morgan's arrow. It is impossible for him to stand here alive. Even as partners, helping each other is the proper meaning. But Morgan's arrow is definitely worth Thorin Oakenshield's deep memory. Because Morgan saved his life. Looking at the solemn Thorin Oakenshield, Morgan smiled and said the same words as Gandalf, "We are partners. Isn't it?" Morgan said and put a hand on Thorin Oakenshield's shoulder and patted it. This action made Thorin Oakenshield stiffen immediately. In his capacity, he hasn't been patted on the shoulder for many years. But in front of Morgan's strength is outstanding, and he just saved himself not long ago. He didn't want to embarrass Morgan and himself with this. Thorin Oakenshield could only suppress his discomfort, and nodded with a slightly embarrassed expression, "Of course." After a brief chat, the expedition team had a short rest and was preparing to continue on the road. Ow! Suddenly, a familiar terrifying howl sounded again. Everyone's expressions changed. Chapter 66. The enemy meets. Time back to a few minutes ago. Just when a group of expedition team members led by Gandalf Morgan rushed out of the underground kingdom's goblin monster army and rushed down the mountain. A heavily armed half-orc wolf army is also coming from the vast and endless forest. They are running fast towards the direction of the Goblin Kingdom. This half-orc cavalry unit is exactly the half-orc unit that chased the expedition team on the rainy night of the stone giant battle yesterday. The leader was an unusually tall pale half-orc riding on a tall white wolf. The speed of the half-orc troops riding on the wolf is much faster than that of the expedition team. When the expedition team rushed out of the dungeon in a thrilling manner and ran wildly for a while, they stopped to take a rest. The half-orc cavalry unit led by the pale half-orc has arrived at the exit of the Goblin Underground Kingdom. It was also the exit where Gandalf Morgan and a group of remote team members escaped from the dungeon not long ago. The pale orc was after learning about the Goblin King in this dungeon. Only then hurried to the Underground Kingdom. Just arrived at the entrance of the Underground Kingdom, the warg with a keen sense of smell immediately smelled the strong breath of the expedition team's dwarves. The pale orc immediately understood that the group of weak and dirty goblin dwarves failed to capture the group of dwarf bastards of the expedition team as he said in the letter, but were escaped by them. Fortunately, the remaining breath was strong at this time, and the group of dwarves had apparently escaped here not long ago. The pale orc immediately turned around and walked quickly towards the direction of the dwarf's left breath. The speed of the wargs in the mountains and forests has always been very fast, and on the way down the mountain, the speed of the half-orc troop far exceeded the galloping pace of the expedition team. I have been chasing after the dwarf scent for a while. The pale orc sitting on the tall white wolf could see a dozen figures appearing in the sparse forest on the mountainside below from a distance. Finally found you. Looking at the figures at the foot of the mountain in the distance. The pale orc murmured, and raised his left hand, which was attached to a sharp thorn sword, to look at it. Immediately, he waved the hammer in his right hand and pointed at the figure in the distance below. With a ferocious expression on his face, he shouted, "Go! Catch up and kill them! Tear them all to shreds!" The pale orc roared loudly, and the wolf cavalry behind him rushed down immediately screaming strangely. But the warg cavalry is still not the fastest are several scout wargs. Because there were no bulky orcs sitting on their backs, these scouting wargs were walking on the ground in the forest. Like the wind, it rushed straight to the expedition team. Ow! The familiar howl of terror sounded. Everyone in the expedition team changed their faces suddenly when they heard this voice. Gandalf reacted the fastest, and immediately shouted, "Run!" In this critical situation, everyone had no time to think too much, so they could only follow behind Gandalf and run forward again. It's just how fast the scouting wolf is. The expedition team hadn't run far, and soon heard the clear roar of the warg coming from the woods behind them. The orc was right behind him, very close at hand. Quick! Thorin Oakenshield roared with a serious expression. Everyone in the expedition team ran forward desperately, even wishing they could grow a few more legs. It just seems to be a coincidence, maybe a trick of fate. This time, the expedition team did not have the good luck they had before. When Nori and Bilbo, the fastest dwarves, rushed to the front of the team and almost stopped suddenly because they fell off the cliff because of their speed. There is no way ahead. This means that everyone in the expedition team cannot escape the pursuit of the orcs and must fight with them. There is no way. There is no way ahead. What to do, Gandalf? Sarling. The dwarf rushed to the edge of the cliff, looking at the boundless cliff not far away and said anxiously. The sound of footsteps in the woods behind him was chaotic, and the low growl of the warg was getting closer and clearer. Ow! Finally, the first scout warg appeared in the sight of everyone in the expedition team. Everyone drew out their weapons one by one, looking anxious. Morgan immediately said, "Wargs can't climb trees, go up trees first." Gandalf was about to speak, but Morgan thought of this first, and immediately answered loudly, "Yes, climb up the tree, everyone." After being told by the two, the dwarves immediately understood. Fortunately, this area is close to the edge of the abyss and endless sea of clouds outside, and there are tall trees with thick branches and luxuriant leaves everywhere. The dwarves are all good at catching fish in the river and touching birds in the trees, and they are too familiar with tree climbing. The same goes for Bilbo the Hobbit. In addition to the many branches of these big pine trees, everyone in the expedition team quickly climbed the tree with hands and feet. At this time, the scout wargs finally caught up. However, the limbs of a warg cannot climb trees like a cat. Several wargs looked at the crowd in the tree, so they could only spin around under the tree, baring their teeth and growling. Morgan looked at the wolves below who looked like targets, his feet tightened on the tree trunk, and he was reaching out to remove the longbow from his back. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of Gandalf whispering to a colorful butterfly on the back of his hand. At this time, accompanied by the sound of chaotic footsteps and strange roars, it quickly approached. Following closely behind the scout warg, the astonishing orc troop finally arrived. The leader is a tall half-orc who rides on a ferocious white warg that is far larger than an ordinary wolf. His skin is pale and he is completely different from other half-orcs. Azog. The half-orc leader known as the Destroyer and the Defiler, Azog. At first glance, Morgan immediately recognized the ferocious, brutal, and powerful half-orc leader in his memory. Same as in memory plot. At this time, the expedition finally encountered the half-orc force led by Azog. Morgan was inexplicable, and immediately raised the longbow in his hand that was aimed at the wolf under the tree, and aimed at the hideous, ugly orc leader who was a little farther away. At this moment, a thought popped up in Morgan's mind uncontrollably: if I shoot this orc leader to death, how much soul power will I get? For the appearance of Azog, the one who was most shocked was naturally not Morgan, nor Gandalf, the dwarf Balin. It was Thorin Oakenshield. Because they are absolute enemies, mortal enemies, the kind who will never die. Azog. Looking at the half-orc riding on the tall white wolf, Thorin Oakenshield murmured. His face was shocked and he couldn't believe it. He didn't believe that he was injured in that kind of situation on the battlefield. Azog is still alive. Thorin Oakenshield looked at Azog with shocked and angry expression. The pale orc Azog looked at Thorin Oakenshield not far away, also very angry. But besides anger, there is also incomparable joy. This time I brought a whole team of elite wolf cavalry, 70 or 80 cavalry. And there are only a dozen or so Thorin Oakenshields in front of him. Next, it will be a massacre, and I will finally have the opportunity to kill the enemy who seriously injured me a few years ago, wash away the shame of the broken arm, and completely end the bastards of the Turin dwarves. Azog looked at Thorin Oakenshield, smiled grimly and said slowly, "Long time no see, Thorin son of Thrain." Chapter 67. Battle of Vengeance 1. Can you feel it? The half-orc leader Azog looked at the people who fled up the big tree a little far away. With the steel thorn arm attached to his left hand, he caressed the white wolf king below him, as if speaking to the wolf below him, as if speaking to everyone in front of him, and slowly speaking as if talking to himself. The taste of fear. Azog raised his head and stared coldly at the angry Thorin Oakenshield in front of him, and continued, "Fear, what a delicious taste! Especially the fear of dwarves. I still remember your grandfather's dying fear, your father's despairing fear, how wonderful it was. Long time no see, Thorin, son of Thrain. Azog looked at Thorin Oakenshield with a sinister grin and spoke slowly. Such provocative words were like the most potent poison, and immediately aroused the monstrous anger in Thorin Oakenshield's heart. It's just that Thorin Oakenshield, who has gone through many hardships, is far tougher and calmer than before. Even though he was short of breath, his fists were clenched tightly, his eyes were red, and the veins on his neck were bulging. Thorin Oakenshield still suppressed his anger, and counterattacked in a cold voice, "Then do you feel your own fear? I was so disappointed that I couldn't kill you in the previous battle. But it's okay, you've come to your door again, it's not too late to kill you now." Thorin Oakenshield spoke in a seemingly calm and cold voice. Everyone present could hear the incomparable anger he suppressed in his calm voice. Having said that, let me briefly mention the grievances and hatred between the Turin dwarves and the half-orcs. Many years ago, the Turin dwarves that Thorin Oakenshield belonged to originally lived in the largest underground kingdom in Middle-earth, Hezadam, also known as Moria. But because the dwarves dug the mine too deeply, they alarmed the powerful evil monster Balrog hidden deep underground. Under the attack of the Balrog, the Turin dwarves suffered heavy losses and had to withdraw from the underground kingdom. Since then, they lost Moria where the Turin dwarves lived for thousands of years and went to the Lonely Mountain. Moria was abandoned, and the orcs of the Misty Mountains took Moria and made it their home. More than 60 years ago, the dwarves of Turin, who managed to grow in the Lonely Mountain, encountered the attack of the giant dragon Smog from the north again. The Turin dwarves had to abandon their homes and go away again. A descendant of Turin, the king of the Lonely Mountain at that time, that is, Sorin Oakenshield's grandfather Thor, ignored the persuasion of the tribe and insisted on leading the tribe to the homeland Moria, but was attacked by half-orcs. This also prompted the outbreak of a fierce war between the dwarves and the orcs, which was also known as the Battle of Asanubaisa. In the Battle of Asanubaisa, Sorin's grandfather Sol, the king of the Lonely Mountain, died in battle, and his father Thorn disappeared. Sorin defeated the half-orc leader Azog in this battle, and the title of Oakshield also from this. In that battle, although the Turin dwarves finally won, they suffered extremely heavy losses. Since then, the hatred between the Turin dwarves and the orcs in the Misty Mountains has further intensified, and they have become complete mortal enemies. This is also the reason for the hatred between the two races. Looking at the dwarf with an extremely angry face, but still as stubborn as a stinky and hard stone in a cesspit, Azog didn't continue to talk nonsense, and pointed at Thorin Oakenshield with a hammer in his right hand and said loudly, "This is mine. Kill all the others." Azog roared ferociously, and all the warg scouts and orc warg knights beside him rushed out with strange screams. At this moment, the moment Azog roared, the arrow Morgan aimed at shot out. Whoosh! The white-tail feathered arrows stained with the goblin monster's blood rushed towards Azog. Azog, who had noticed the existence of Morgan holding a longbow, smiled disdainfully. The moment the arrow arrived in front of him, he suddenly raised the steel spur arm of his left hand to block his face and chest. Boom! After a short and intense sound of gold and iron colliding, the arrow hit the steel thorn arm in response. Morgan's arrow was extraordinarily hard, and the moment the arrow hit the steel thorn arm, it was immediately broken in two and fell to the ground. Along with the wolf scouts and the half-orc wolf cavalry rushed out. Not many people noticed Morgan's arrow, except for Gandalf, Thorin Oakenshield, who had been paying attention to his mortal enemy. Regarding Morgan's arrow, Gandalf only smiled slightly, while Thorin Oakenshield frowned slightly, but said nothing. Seeing that the arrow was blocked, Morgan was not surprised at all. On such a frontal battlefield, at such a long distance, the opponent is completely on guard. It would be weird if he could shoot Azog. For such a powerful guy, the best chance to win is only when the opponent is not paying attention. There are not many arrows left in the quiver. Morgan missed a single attempt and immediately switched targets. Aiming the longbow at the wolf knight rushing down below, he stretched out his hand and quickly drew an arrow, and shot with the bow. Although the canine scouts of Gundabad can't climb trees, however, they are slender and tall, and they are fast. Under the dash, they can jump several meters at a time. With sharp fangs and sharp teeth, the warg rushed towards the members of the expedition team on the tree frantically, and the momentum was astonishing. The branches as thick as an adult's arm were easily crushed and broken by the wargs, and the dwarves were frightened and hurried to climb higher up the tree. But the half-orcs are not stupid, seeing that they can't attack the dwarves on the tree for a while. immediately ordered the wolves to change their targets, and chose to bite the trunk of the big tree where the members of the expedition team were. The teeth of the wargs are extremely sharp, under the combined efforts of several wargs. The trunks of these towering trees can't stand the damage at all. In just a few seconds, a big tree was crumbling from the bite of the wolves. Morgan! Morgan! Keely! The dwarves called out to Morgan and Keely in a hurry. In this case, unless they go down to fight, they will definitely not be able to attack the wargs below. It's just that Keely's bow and arrow were captured when he was captured by goblins in the underground kingdom. When getting out of trouble, in that critical situation, there was only time to take the short sword, and there was no time to take the long bow and arrow. So at this time, only Morgan in the expedition team still kept the long bow and arrow. After the fierce battle in the underground kingdom, there were only a dozen or so arrows left in Morgan's quiver. I just shot down several orcs and wargs in a row, and consumed several of them. At this time, there were only 5 or 6 arrows left in his quiver. But facing the number of wolves below at least 50 or 60. What can these arrows be used for? Click! Click! The terrifying biting force of the warg sent the sawdust flying. It didn't take long for the several big trees where everyone in the expedition team was to be crunched and crumbling. Finally, with a crackling sound, the first big tree fell to the dwarf's exclamation. Chapter 68. Battle of Vengeance 2. Click! There was a loud crackling sound. The first big tree carrying the members of the expedition began to break. Then the second strain. The third strain. Finally, when the 4 big trees on the edge of the cliff were all bitten off by the ferocious wargs, a group of members of the expedition had to return to the ground again. Looking at the panicked figures of the group of dwarves jumping down from the tree in a distance, Azog grinned and shouted, "Go, kill them, leave no one behind." After the words fell, the scout wargs and half-orc cavalry who had been surrounding the expedition team roared, and immediately rushed towards the expedition team frantically. The opportunity finally came. Azog also didn't want to wait, roared loudly and at the same time rode the tall white warg under him and jumped off the boulder, rushing forward. Seeing the situation quickly turn for the worst, fighting was inevitable. The members of the expedition immediately drew their weapons. Kill! Kill these half-orc bastards! Facing the half-orcs that were several times larger than his own, Thorin Oakenshield was not afraid at all, brandishing the elven sword and roaring, he rushed forward first. Thorin Oakenshield was in front, and the dwarves behind were also fearless, responding to the dwarf king's anger, brandishing weapons to meet the attacking orcs and wargs. Looking at the battlefield where the battle became a battle in an instant, Morgan held the elven longsword in both hands, and also met the ferocious wolf who rushed towards him. Although bows and arrows kill enemies more simply and quickly, but at this moment, there were only 2 or 3 arrows left in Morgan's quiver. What is the use of 2 or 3 arrows? Rather than using them now, it is better to keep them first. This time, Morgan focused on the orc leader Azog. If there is a chance, he will never be stingy to give Azog another arrow. The Gundaba warg rushed forward fiercely with a stench. Morgan moved his feet, turned sideways and flexibly avoided the bite of the wolf's messy fangs and the pounce of a pair of forelimbs, and the long sword in his hand quickly changed into a stab followed closely behind. The elven longsword easily pierced through the wolf's abdomen. The moment the long sword pierced into the wolf's abdomen, Morgan immediately noticed the strange cry of the half-orc behind him. So he quickly drew out the long sword, turned around without looking at it, and slashed behind him with a fierce sword. A half-orc who took the opportunity to sneak attack was just approaching with a black hatchet in his hand, when he encountered this head-on sword. The piercing Sinyan sword light flashed away. A line of blood immediately extended from the forehead of the sneak-attacking orc to his crotch. Next second, the half-orc's frightened face was divided into 2 neatly along with his body. Wow! The colorful and stinky viscera of the big beach immediately exploded all over the ground, and black blood spread wantonly. A sword split the attacking orc in half. Morgan didn't take a second look, but raised his sword and rushed towards the battlefield not far away where the orcs were besieging Gandalf. The melee wizard Gandalf has a sharp offensive with a staff and a long sword. With his tall stature, Gandalf is very conspicuous on the entire battlefield. This immediately attracted a large number of orcs and wargs to besiege. Bilbo was following Gandalf at this time, holding a short sword and trying his best to deal with the siege of the surrounding orc wolves. With the arduous training in the underground kingdom not long ago, Bilbo's performance at this time is obviously much better than before. But Bilbo's basic strength is limited, and no matter how good his performance is, he can't go much better. Compared with the powerful combination of Morgan and Gandalf in the past, the combination of Bilbo and Gandalf is obviously much worse. Facing the siege of a large number of enemies, Gandalf had to take care of Bilbo from time to time while he was trying his best to deal with the orcs and wargs. For a while, the combination of Gandalf and Bilbo was almost being beaten by the orc-warg, and they could only respond passively without fighting back. At this moment, Morgan's figure quickly appeared outside the encirclement. After killing a wolf with a sneak attack with a sword, Morgan quickly rushed into the encirclement and stood beside Gandalf. "It's all right, Gandalf." Morgan quickly glanced at Gandalf, looked at the bloody grey robe on the opponent's body that was torn into shape, cut off a half-orc's attack with a sword, and said casually, "Of course it's okay, the half-orcs can't do anything to me." Hearing the hint of ridicule in Morgan's words, Gandalf waved his staff and smashed a half-orc, and immediately replied. With the addition of Morgan, the combination of Bilbo and Gandalf immediately became a lot easier. On the other side of the battlefield, a group of dwarves were also fighting desperately. Although the number is far less than that of the half-orcs, the dwarves are almost always fighting in pairs, which seems to be quite organized. Even between groups, the dwarves were not too far apart. This is beneficial for other dwarves to support in the first place once someone is in danger. As soon as the battle between the orcs and the expedition team broke out, it quickly fell into a fierce stalemate. Although the expedition team seems to be at a disadvantage in general, but the orc side was far from winning. However, whether it is the battlefield where Morgan and Gandalf fight side by side with half-orcs, or the battlefield where a group of dwarves fight with half-orcs, it can't compare to the other two bosses' battlefield. With the special roll call by the orc leader Azog before the battle, the other orcs and wargs obviously deliberately avoided Thorin Oakenshield. After Thorin Oakenshield killed a half-orc blocking the way, he quickly rushed towards his life-and-death enemy Azog. The same was true for Azog, as if he couldn't see other enemies in his eyes, he rode a tall white warg straight towards Thorin Oakenshield who was rushing towards him. Near. Closer. Boom. Thorin Oakenshield and Azog who was riding a white warg finally collided fiercely. After a sound like gold and iron colliding, Thorin Oakenshield flew upside down several meters and fell to the ground. When the white warg carried Azog to the ground, he obviously staggered a bit. In the first round, there was no winner. Thorin Oakenshield quickly turned over and stood up, spat out a mouthful of blood, then grabbed a piece of dead tree trunk as a shield, and rushed towards Azog again. The white warg shook the foreleg that had just touched Thorin Oakenshield's long sword, and under Azog's order, bared his teeth and roared, rushed towards Thorin Oakenshield again. Boom! After a muffled sound, the dead tree trunk used as a shield by Thorin Oakenshield was slammed into the air by Azog riding a white wolf, and Thorin Oakenshield was also knocked over on the spot. At this moment, from the very beginning, the members of the expedition team who had been watching the two battlefields couldn't help feeling tense when they saw this scene. As soon as Azog, who had won the second round, landed on his warg, he immediately swung his ferocious knife and hammer and came back again. Thorin Oakenshield, who escaped from the underground kingdom, was exhausted physically and mentally. Facing Azog was also supported by an incomparable anger and a tired body that seemed to have recovered. These two heavy falls in a row finally made Thorin Oakenshield's exhaustion suppressed by anger burst out. Thorin Oakenshield gasped and struggled to stand up, facing the menacing Azog. It was too late to resist. Azog brandished a huge ferocious knife and hammer and smashed it hard on the chest of Thorin Oakenshield. Boom! There was a heart-shattering dull sound. In response, Thorin Oakenshield was hit by Azog with a knife and hammer for several meters, and fell heavily to the ground. Chapter 69. Battle of Vengeance 3. Boom! Watching Thorin Oakenshield being hit hard by Azog with a knife and hammer. No! No! Shorin! The dwarves who had been closely watching Thorin Oakenshield and the battlefield of Azog immediately shouted eagerly. The dwarves' eyes were red with anxiety, and they immediately attacked the orcs and wargs in front of them like crazy, hoping to rush out to save Thorin Oakenshield. But all the half-orcs and wargs also saw the power of the big leader defeating the dwarf leader. At such a moment, the half-orcs would only become more excited and scream to stop the dwarves from saving Thorin Oakenshield. The number of half-orcs is much more than that of the expedition team. At this time, the orcs and wargs attacked more intensely, and the dwarves couldn't get out of the encirclement in a short time. Another battlefield. Morgan and Gandalf were also shocked when they saw the scene where Thorin Oakenshield was slammed into the air by Azog. The importance of Thorin Oakenshield to the expedition is beyond doubt. Even if Morgan knew the memory plot of this episode in his mind, he was still worried at this time. In the memory plot, after Thorin Oakenshield failed to single out Azog, it was Bilbo who rescued him in time. Not to mention whether the plot is reasonable enough or not. Now, under the care of himself and Gandalf, Bilbo was trying his best to deal with the besieging orcs and wargs around him. How can there be spare energy to save Thorin Oakenshield? Morgan remembered clearly. Not long ago, Thorin Oakenshield was almost beheaded by the Goblin King in the Underground Kingdom. Looking at the similar scene in front of him, Morgan seemed to suddenly think of something. Something flashed through my mind like lightning. Knowing that the time was urgent, Morgan raised his sword and split the half-orc who was rushing, and said quickly, "Gandalf, Bilbo, cover me." After the words fell, Morgan immediately approached Gandalf, and the long sword in his hand was inserted back into the scabbard. At the same time, he quickly took off the long bow on his back and drew out the arrow. Gandalf, who had also been paying attention to Thorin Oakenshield, immediately understood Morgan's movements. As soon as Morgan retreated, the orcs and wargs in his direction immediately rushed forward ferociously. A burst of dazzling white light erupted immediately from the tip of the staff that Gandalf waved, knocking the ferocious orcs and wargs into the air. At this time, Bilbo also understood the importance of what Morgan was doing, holding a short sword with a tense expression, and tightly blocked Morgan, who was preparing a longbow and arrows behind him. On the central battlefield that attracts everyone's attention, Thorin Oakenshield fell to the ground with a heavy blow from Azog, and the corner of his mouth immediately bled. His already extremely tired and injured body became heavier and weaker from this blow. Azog rode on a tall and fierce white wolf and walked quickly towards the Thorin Oakenshield that fell on the ground, sneering constantly, "Is this your strength, Sarling?" Thorin Oakenshield looked angry, and tried his best to stand up, but was stepped on his chest by the white warg who approached quickly. "Is it the life of wandering and fleeing like a wild dog that made you lose your fighting spirit? Or have you been exhausted by escaping from those weak, filthy goblins?" The tall white warg bared his teeth, revealing the sharp and cold white teeth full of saliva, and greedily looked at the embarrassing dwarf king in front of him. As long as the master gives an order, the white wolf can immediately tear the dwarf prince into pieces and swallow it quickly. Azog sat on the tall wolf, looking down at the oak shield of Thorin struggling under his feet. His face was cold and proud. "You really let me down, Thorin. In that case, let me send you to see your grandfather and your father. Let you have a good reunion." With a grinning grin, Azog raised the giant knife and hammer in his hand and threw it at Thorin Oakenshield. This blow had to be smashed hard. No matter how tenacious Rensuil Oakeshield's vitality was, his head would be cracked and his brain would be cracked and he would die violently. "No. Shorin. Shorin. Do not." On the battlefield a little far away, the dwarves roared in despair, and they frantically attacked the orcs and wargs in front of them. But the orcs don't know the importance of stopping these dwarves at this time. The battle between the two sides became more and more intense. On another battlefield not far from the dwarves, Morgan's bow and arrow immediately attracted the attention of all the orcs around. The little orc leader was not stupid. After realizing the intention of the surrounded humans, he immediately commanded the orcs and the wolves to launch a more fierce attack on the three of them. In order to protect Morgan save Thorin Oakenshield is not disturbed. Gandalf opened up, and one after another magic continued to explode in the crowd of half-orcs, blowing up the surrounding half-orcs and wargs. At the same time, the tall white wolf king stomped on the constantly struggling Thorin Oakenshield. With a triumphant grin, Azog swung down the giant saber and hammer in his hand, and slammed it at the head of Thorin Oakenshield. "It's now." Morgan aimed at Azog's finger on the bowstring and plucked it immediately. Whizzing! The two arrows shot away with a howling sound of piercing through the air. Azog, who smashed at Thorin Oakenshield with a grinning grin, immediately felt a sense of extreme danger. Only then did he suddenly remember that there was a human archer among the group of dwarves on the opposite side. His hammer will definitely smash Thorin Oakenshield's head to pieces. But he will also be shot by the opponent. He was not willing to accept such a life-for-life exchange. What a good time to choose, this damn human archer. Suddenly, Azog gritted his teeth and made a choice. With a hammer in his hand, his whole body immediately fell back. Next second, whizzing! An arrow suddenly shot into the white wolf's head. An arrow almost shot past Azog's head. At this moment, there was only one fear in Azog's mind: if he hesitated just now, the arrow must have hit his head. Ow! The white wolf that was shot in the head by an arrow fell backwards, screaming and screaming. Azog, who had just escaped, was immediately overturned to the ground. Azog quickly got up in a rage, neither caring about the huge white wolf king who was twitching and screaming constantly beside him, nor caring about the human archer not far away. Instead, he brandished the hammer and threw himself at Thorin Oakenshield at the side. As long as Thorin Oakenshield was killed, all other losses would be worthwhile for Azog. It's just that Thorin Oakenshield, who was still struggling just now, couldn't grasp such an opportunity. The moment the white wolf who stepped on him was shot over, Thorin Oakenshield rolled aside immediately. Ordinary people can burst out with an incomparable desire to survive under extreme danger, not to mention the dwarf king Thorin Oakenshield. He got up almost at the same time as Azog. When Azog rushed forward in anger, Thorin Oakenshield rushed forward again without fear. The two fought together again in an instant. At this time, a loud eagle howl suddenly came from the distant sky. It spread across the entire cliff valley in an instant. Chapter 70. The loud eagle's roar quickly spread across the sea of clouds, valleys, cliffs, and the chaotic battlefield on the edge of the cliff. The dwarves who were fighting naturally didn't know what the roar of the eagle represented. All they saw was that Morgan was once again in dire straits. One arrow shot back the orc leader Azog. One arrow killed Azog's white warg. Save them once again, Thorin Oakenshield, the dwarf king of Turin. Seeing that the danger of Thorin Oakenshield was temporarily lifted, the dwarves and his party looked ecstatic and even more excited. Howling, they began to fight back against the orcs and wargs who besieged them. It has to be said that the members of the dwarf expedition chosen by Thorin Oakenshield were very good. Stubbornness is in the nature of dwarves. The only difference between a dwarf and a dwarf is stubbornness and more stubbornness. The will and tenacity other than stubbornness are not possessed by every dwarf. But the expedition's dwarves did. In less than 2 days, he experienced thrilling stone giant battles one after another. He was captured and tortured by the goblin monsters in the underground kingdom, and then escaped from the trap. He rushed out of the underground kingdom from the countless goblin monster army. Now they are fighting hard and fiercely against the elite wolf cavalry of the orcs with few against many. This requires not only strength, but also great tenacity and determination to do all this. The strength of the fully armed half-orc elite cavalry is obviously not comparable to those short and poorly equipped goblin monsters in the underground kingdom. But even so, the total was at 80 riders, 5 times as many as on the orc side of the expedition. For the expedition team that has experienced many battles, it is still a lot worse. Although all members of the expedition team were injured. However, the orcs were killed by nearly half of the orcs by the more elite and powerful expedition team. The corpses of orcs and wargs were lying all around the battlefield. At this time, the half-orc leader Azog accidentally overturned the car, and the dwarf leader Thorin Oakenshield stood up tenaciously. The morale of the expedition team soared, and they immediately counterattacked the orcs. The half-orcs on one side of the expedition team, which was originally 5 times the number, could obviously suppress the members of the expedition team. Now it is very reluctant. The howling of eagles in the sky kept coming, becoming louder and clearer. On another battlefield not far from the small battlefield of the dwarves. When Morgan and Gandalf heard the first howl of the eagle, they almost unanimously breathed a sigh of relief. As far as Gandalf was concerned, it was he who called the giant eagle that was coming to help in the sky, and of course he knew it. For Morgan, through the memory of the plot in his mind, he knew that this was the reinforcement called by Gandalf, but he knew it well but could not say it clearly. Seeing Morgan suddenly relaxed, Gandalf only thought that Morgan saved Thorin Oakenshield from Azog. Neither of them spoke. Gandalf was shocked and continued to deal with the orcs and wargs who rushed forward. Morgan shot Azog with an arrow, and after the white wolf shot with an arrow, he resolutely withdrew his bow and pulled out the high elf sword again. There was only one arrow left in the quiver, and shooting an orc and a warg to death would not change anything quickly, so it was better to keep it as a spare. As for Azog, he just shot the opponent with an arrow, and the opponent must be on guard next time. This guy is powerful, when he is on guard. Continuing to use such an ordinary longbow and arrows on his body, it is almost difficult to hit the opponent. Morgan knew this well. He suddenly felt a little regretful, if he could have thought of this earlier, in Rivendell a month ago, when Eldrin Elflord asked him what he needed. He should have wanted a good longbow and arrows, not a precious oak pipe that could only be used to smoke from fatigue. Otherwise, at this time, Azog would never dare to be so arrogant when he saw him. The howling of the eagle in the sky is getting closer and clearer. On the battlefield on the edge of the cliff, the expedition team and the orcs fought hard. The leader of the expedition, Thorin Oakenshield, and the orc leader, Azog, once again fought together. Thorin Oakenshield's tenacious willpower is indeed very strong. I was knocked down again and again, and stood up again and again. Without the help of the White Wolf King, Azog had the upper hand against Thorin Oakenshield. But he couldn't hit Thorin Oakenshield with one blow like before. The battle between the two fell into a stalemate. At this time, in the sky above the cliff, huge figures of giant eagles finally appeared. Accompanied by the extremely clear and loud howling of the eagle, the first giant eagle swooped down to the battlefield below. Except for Morgan and Gandalf, who know each other well on the battlefield. Everyone was shocked by this huge giant eagle. When the first giant eagle swooped down, it easily grabbed the warg with its metallic luster and sharp claws, flew into the sky, and dropped it at high altitude. The morale of everyone in the expedition team was immediately shaken. Look, there are many giant eagles coming from the sky. The eagle is dealing with the orcs. Great, is the giant eagle here to help us? Gandalf. Of course, they are our reinforcements, they are here to help us. As soon as Bilbo noticed the great eagle in the sky, he asked Gandalf who was beside him. Gandalf immediately replied with a smile on his face. At the same time, I was secretly refreshed, and finally someone asked. After the first giant eagle swooped down, the giant eagle troop finally arrived, and the second, third, and fourth giant eagles began to swoop down to the battlefield below. For a time, a large number of orcs and wargs were easily taken into the sky by the giant eagles. Facing a behemoth with a height of 3 to 5 meters and a maximum wingspan of nearly 20 meters. The orcs and wargs had no power to resist at all. In addition, a pair of huge eagle claws are as hard as gold and iron, and as sharp as hooks. Such a huge eagle can easily snatch 1 or 2 orcs and a wolf with just one dive. Whether it is to tear it on the spot with its sharp claws, or fly into the air and let go of the eagle claws, it can easily kill the orc warg. In a short time, facing the swooping attack of the giant eagle, the orcs and wargs were frightened and fled in a hurry. The orcs and wargs ran in panic, and the members of the expedition team immediately freed their hands. The dwarves rushed to Thorin Oakenshield, who was fighting Azog. Morgan and Gandalf also rushed to the battlefield of the two of them immediately. Just when everyone was planning to besiege the orc leader Azog. Suddenly, in the forest far ahead, there was a burst of chaotic footsteps and noisy strange calls. Morgan and Gandalf, who were the first to notice the strangeness, stopped immediately. If you look carefully, you can see a dense black figure rushing towards this side quickly. Small in stature, poorly equipped, hideous and dirty. Who else is not the group of goblin monsters in the underground kingdom before? Chapter 71. Escape from Ascension. Looking at the dense army of goblin monsters rushing here in the distant forest, Morgan's complexion changed, and he immediately looked up at the sky. It was noon at this time. The ball of light that had been hanging high in the sky disappeared at some point. The sky is full of large black clouds, and shadows enveloped the earth. The sky was gloomy, heavy with lead clouds. This is the prelude to the rain. Morgan looked at the changing sky, and then at the group of goblin monsters attacking, and then he suddenly understood. Not good. Gandalf, who was looking at the sky almost at the same time as Morgan, changed his face drastically, and glanced at Morgan beside him, and immediately said, "Go. Bahrain, chili fillet. Beverly Boom. Bilbo. We should go." After shouting, Gandalf rushed towards the cliff. Morgan followed without hesitation. The movement of the goblin monster army cannot be hidden from others. The arrival of the expedition dwarves immediately scared off the orc leader Azog. Hearing Gandalf's shout at this time, and looking at the dense army of goblin monsters attacking in the distance, he was immediately taken aback. "Damn it, those goblin monsters are coming, let's go. Quickly, follow Gandalf." "Wait, there's a cliff ahead, what is Gandalf doing running there? You idiot, haven't you seen so many giant eagles in the sky? Quick, both of you shut up and follow." The dwarves ran forward quickly while supporting Thorin Oakenshield. The gigantic giant eagle in the sky was still hunting the orcs and wargs who were fleeing in a hurry. A little far away, the orc leader Azog stood in the shadows, looking at the giant eagles flying in the sky, the panicked orcs and wargs under his command, and the dwarves fleeing quickly, with an incomparably gloomy and ferocious expression. Watching the expedition run towards the cliff, the giant eagles quickly sensed what Gandalf meant. Immediately gave up the pursuit of the remaining half-orcs, and flew towards the cliff one after another. Cliff edge. Looking at the abyss ahead, and the strong wind blowing constantly. Morgan wasn't the only one who felt trembling. The dwarves who arrived quickly said one after another. Well, how do we get there? Are we going to go on the backs of those giant eagles? This is too scary. I'm a little dizzy. Don't talk nonsense, those half-orcs haven't gone far yet, the army of goblin monsters will arrive soon, if you are afraid, then you too should stay here. At this time, the giant eagles finally flew over to everyone. Gandalf, who heard the worry of the dwarves, said in a loud voice, just like me. After speaking, Gandalf jumped out when the giant eagle flew over the cliff ahead. It happened to be picked up by the giant eagle on its back, and it was quickly taken up to the sky. At this moment, the sound of footsteps and noise in the distance behind became louder and clearer. When everyone turned their heads, they saw the army of goblin monsters approaching rapidly. Orcs, too, seemed to realize that the eagle had no time to attack them at this moment. Azog was riding on a black wolf, and the few orcs who had been hunted down by the giant eagle were striding towards the edge of the cliff where the expedition team was. Thorin Oakenshield's complexion suddenly changed and he shouted, "Hurry up!" Fortunately, the giant eagles are flying towards the edge of the cliff one after another. With Gandalf's example, the dwarves jumped off the cliff one after another. Even if the timing of someone's jump is wrong, it is not a problem for Giant Eagle. With just an acceleration, the dwarves were perfectly picked up by the giant eagle on their backs. When it was Morgan's turn, the terror of the army of orcs and goblin monsters behind him quickly overwhelmed the slightest fear of the cliff height. Morgan jumped down decisively, and then found himself in a pile of warm and fluffy black feathers. When the last member of the expedition, Thorin Oakenshield, was also picked up by the giant eagle, and quickly flew high into the sky. Azog, who was one step late riding a black warg, could only be furious at the figure of the giant eagle going away in the sky. Morgan sat on the back of the giant eagle, looking at the orc leader Azog, who was getting smaller and smaller on the cliff in the distance behind him, thinking to himself. He was not surprised that he failed to shoot Azog this time. Except for Gandalf, whose strength is unknown, and Rivendell's Eldrin elf lord, who can't see the strength. Azog is the strongest Morgan has seen so far. Even Thorin Oakenshield, who has the strongest swordsmanship in the team, is much worse than Azog. But when it comes to actual combat, especially on the battlefield, it has a lot of influence. This is why Thorin Oakenshield was able to defeat Azog in the Battle of Fame, Battle of Asan-yu-Bai-Sa, cut off an arm of the opponent, and almost killed Azog. But in this cliff battlefield, the reason why Thorin Oakenshield was completely defeated by Azog. Although physical fatigue has a great influence, the difference in strength is definitely the root cause. And with Morgan's swordsmanship strength at this time, it should be comparable to Thorin Oakenshield. Of course, who is stronger will not be known until you have tried it. This is just Morgan's guess after secretly speculating and comparing. However, Morgan has a system, and his future strength will surpass Thorin Oakenshield. Surpassing Azog is a certainty. All that is missing is time. Giant eagles are fast. After flying over the cliffs and mountains shrouded in clouds, the sky suddenly brightened. It was the middle of the day at this time. In autumn, the golden sun shines on everything on the earth. There is the whistling wind beside my ears, the small continuous mountains below, and the endless sea of clouds in the distance. Sitting on the back of the giant eagle, Morgan's mind was quickly attracted by the incomparably magnificent scenery in front of him. Compared with sitting in a small iron plane in the previous life, the feeling of sitting on the giant eagle is really good. Looking at the incomparably magnificent scenery in front of you, Morgan's fear of heights had already dissipated. Morgan turned over, put his hands behind his head, and lay on the warm, fluffy feathers of the giant eagle. Looking at the vast and clean sky, his heart quickly became calm. Although I failed to kill Azog in this battle, I did kill the opponent's White Wolf King. There are also 7 or 89 orcs and wargs who were killed by myself. This battle is definitely not a loss. There are even more goblin monsters that were killed in the underground kingdom before. Although I can't remember how many goblin monsters I killed, it must be far more than the orcs and wargs I killed. Also, the Goblin King was also killed by his own arrow. It counts like this. The soul power harvested this time will be more than the previous 2 times. Thinking of this, a trace of excitement immediately rose in Morgan's heart, his mind moved slightly, and he decisively summoned the system. Brush brush. A series of virtual data began to jump and flicker out of thin air and appeared in front of my eyes. Chapter 72. Big Harvest. The wind whistling by my ears. In front of him was an extremely clean and bright blue sky. With his hands pressed behind his head, he lay on his back on the warm wings of the giant eagle's back. Morgan summoned the transmigrator system. Brush brush. A series of virtual data jumps and flickers in front of my eyes. Transmigrator, Morgan. Race, human. Biology level, tier dash. Soul power, 1-4. Attributes, strength LV2, constitution LV3+, agility LV3+, spirit LV3. Ability, common language, Muay Thai LV2, white crow sword LV2, bow and archery LV3. Talent, intimacy, special skill. Current world exploration progress, 1.03%. Look at the data that keeps flashing in front of you. Morgan stared at the column of soul power that he cared about most. Finally, after a series of familiar data flashed, the soul power appeared, 14. 14 points. After seeing the number behind the column of soul power clearly, the expression on Morgan's face, which was originally slightly excited, quickly became a little strange. It looked like disappointment, but also vaguely not. After a long time, Morgan secretly sighed in his heart. This kind of soul power gain was actually beyond his expectation, but also within reason. It has been several months since I came to this world, and I have been thinking about the system on my body for several months. Especially in the last 1 or 2 months, compare the harvest by killing creatures. In fact, I can already know roughly what the system's algorithm for soul power is. This time, 2 consecutive battles came down. In fact, Morgan already had some guesses in his heart about how much soul power he could get. Just because there are too many analyses, it is not easy to explain too clearly. Now I can see the soul power harvested by the system. Morgan was neither disappointed nor elated. Because these are all he worked hard for. Whether it's in Dungeon Kingdom, face that army of goblin monsters. Still on the edge of the cliff, the orc warg cavalry led by the orc leader Azog blocked the road. Morgan gained soul power in exchange for fighting on the battlefield. He couldn't be distracted during the battle, and he didn't have much time to think about how much soul power he could get by killing this goblin monster, and how much he could get by killing that half-orc. It was only after the battle that he remembered the soul power harvested by the system on his body. Therefore, compared to the previous 1 or 2 months, the excitement of counting the soul power after the battle came. Morgan, who has gone through 2 lifetimes, is much calmer now. Like 2 people with the same amount of wealth. One is to buy lottery tickets and suddenly get rich because of luck. The other is the wealth accumulated step by step because of doing business. Even if both have the same wealth. But the mood of the 2 is absolutely worlds apart. Of course, Morgan is far more calm in the face of the harvest from the system than before. This does not mean that he does not pay attention to it. Otherwise it would be too pretentious. He was only after understanding the system's approximate calculation method for obtaining soul power. He has calculated his soul power gain in advance. With preparation in this way, the expectations in my heart will naturally not be so high. Because Morgan knows that the system cannot go wrong. Even if there is a system error, it must not be a system error, but Morgan's miscalculation. He let out a long breath. Morgan pushed the chaotic thoughts out of his mind. This time, I can harvest 14 points of soul power. To be honest, Morgan didn't feel disappointed at all, but felt that he had earned it. Because according to his estimation, the soul power he may get this time is less than the current system gives. The extra is naturally earned. Looking back to the virtual data column in front of him, Morgan continued to read. On the data bar, data such as attributes, abilities, and talents have not changed. But when you see the current world exploration progress column, Morgan stared blankly. Not only because the world exploration progress soared from 0.52% 2 days ago to 1.03%. Morgan knew that in the past 2 days, he had gone through a battle with giant boulders, a battle with goblin monsters in the underground kingdom, and was intercepted by the big villain, half-orc leader Azog. After these 3 battles, the progress of world exploration will definitely soar. But I didn't expect the increase to be more than the sum of all the progress in the previous few months. If only that was the case. Morgan now actually sees that the entire column of the current world exploration progress is emitting a faint green light. What does it mean? Morgan saw such a strangeness that he had never seen before, and immediately had such doubts in his mind. But soon, looking at the strangeness in this column, Morgan suddenly felt inexplicably familiar. In his previous life, when he was traveling and relaxing, he would also play mobile games as a pastime. When completing a certain task achievement in the game, a similar screen will appear on the game page. Just like the picture you see in front of you. Thinking of this, Morgan's mind immediately acted irresistibly. He clicked on the current world exploration progress column that was shining with light green light. Next second. Brush brush. Immediately, a series of dummy data flashed and jumped out. The first achievement is achieved. Achievement rewards are being distributed. It's really accomplished, and there are rewards. Morgan was overjoyed. Then, he saw the empty and calm front of him. A little white light is flickering. Then came the second point, and the third point of light appeared and began to converge. When they converge into a light cluster the size of an adult's fist, all the light was suddenly sucked in. Then, a beautiful silver-white ring fell off. Morgan picked up the ring from his chest, looked at it, touched it. After confirming that it was the real thing, I froze. He felt like he was playing a game now. So he immediately touched his face, patted his arms, and finally even squeezed his own nipples. Finally, after confirming that everything is very realistic and absolutely real. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. Picking up the ring again, Morgan was able to truly observe the ring rewarded by the system carefully. Silvery white, it looks more lustrous than ordinary silver products. But that's it. In addition, the entire inner and outer rings of the ring can't see any other inscriptions or anything like that. The whole appearance looks like an ordinary silver ring. In addition to the brighter color, it is more beautiful than ordinary silver rings. There is nothing special about this ring. But it's impossible for the system to just reward me with such an ordinary silver ring. After reading it over and over again, Morgan frowned and thought secretly. Such silver rings, with my current financial resources, I can buy a lot of them at will. How much time and effort did I spend to push the world exploration progress to -% and complete the first achievement? The rewards of the system can never be so ordinary, this ring must have something special. Morgan looked at the ring in front of him and thought hard. Suddenly, he thought of something, and immediately put a mental attempt on the silver ring. Then Morgan's eyes widened. Chapter 73. The future can be expected. The group of giant eagles soared high above the sky carrying the expedition team. Fly over plains and highlands, over forests and rivers, over mountains and seas of clouds. Looking down on the earth from the windy sky. Such a miraculous experience may only come once in a lifetime. Members of the expedition, except for those who fell asleep from exhaustion. Everyone else was lying on the back of the giant eagle, enjoying the unprecedented magnificent scenery of Middle-earth to their heart's content. Because the distance between the giant eagle groups is not too far. The dwarves even shouted hello to each other. But all of this has nothing to do with Morgan. He is immersed in his own world and cannot extricate himself. He looked at the silver-white ring in his hand in front of him. Morgan really didn't expect this to be a space ring with storage capacity. For entertainment in his previous life, Morgan also watched a lot of movies, TV novels, and the like. For the magical props that can hold a lot of things without taking up any space, there is a similar name: storage bag, storage ring, space bag, dimensional space magic equipment and so on. But he didn't expect that he could actually see it in his lifetime. But whenever Morgan laments the magic of the world, he always thinks about the system on his body. Speaking of which, in front of the transmigrator system on him, everything else is miraculous, not miraculous. Looking at the silver ring in front of him, Morgan took out all his belongings from his body, a fist-sized cloth bag full of gems of various colors. This is Morgan's catch in the cave of the 3 rock trolls. Then, after Morgan carefully attached a trace of spirit to the cloth bag, he directed it towards the silver ring. Next second, the cloth bag full of gems disappeared in an instant. Morgan immediately poked out a trace of energy and went to the silver ring. Soon, an empty space about the size of an ordinary room appeared. In the middle of the spacious and empty space, a fist-sized cloth bag stood there impressively. Sensing the magical effect of the silver ring, Morgan quickly withdrew. Then he took off the long bow on his body, and began to try to move in and out with elf swords and the like. After playing for a while, Morgan felt familiar with it, then took out the longbow and sword and put it aside. The gem bag on his body, and small things like the employment contract with Thorin Oakshield were put into the silver ring. But for something so conspicuous as a longbow and elf sword, Morgan wouldn't be foolish enough to put it in. There is no doubting the value of a ring such as having storage space. Morgan had no intention or thought of exposing such a miraculous thing to the eyes of others. Reorganize the things on your body, although there are not many things. Only then did Morgan carefully put the silver ring on the little finger of his left hand. Look at the ring on his left hand. Morgan was in a good mood, very good. The usefulness of a thing ring that can fit an entire room is too great. Especially for the long-term adventurous self. He also thought that when he arrived at Gushan as he wished and entered the underground kingdom of Gushan, he was going to make a fortune. In the memory plot, there are too many golden treasures occupied by the dragon Smog in the treasure house of the underground kingdom of Lonely Mountain. The wealth like mountains and seas made Morgan's blood boil when he watched it in front of the movie screen in his previous life. What's more, coming to this world now, there will be such opportunities in the future. Morgan will definitely find a way to make a fortune. He didn't know how long he would stay in this Middle Earth, or if he would stay in this world forever. But as long as he is alive, he needs money. It's not that Morgan can't forget the time at the blacksmith's shop in Hobbiton, Bilbo's hometown. I want to buy a wire chain mail because of the embarrassment when I don't have enough money. He wanted to change the long sword, but he was too shy to even ask the blacksmith for the price of the long sword. Although the long sword in his hand has now become a high elf sword. But he was still wearing the plain leather suit he'd bought from Hobbiton. And now it has been damaged in many places, and the skin has been worn out. In 2 lives, Morgan knows better than anyone the benefits of having money and the embarrassment of not having money. Therefore, Morgan had this idea when he first met Gandalf and participated in the expedition. Now I have a silver ring on my hand. Morgan was even more determined to find a way to make a fortune from Thorin Oakenshield's Lonely Mountain treasure house when the time came. In this way, his future life in Middle-earth will be more secure. He wants to wander around the world, play everywhere, and roam around everywhere, so it can be implemented very well. It's not because of the need for money, the hard life of being a ranger or a bounty hunter who takes quests everywhere to earn a little hard money. What's more, Morgan saved Thorin Oakenshield time and time again at critical moments. Morgan didn't think it was too much to take a little of his treasure. Looking at the ring on the little finger of his left hand, Morgan became more and more satisfied. He knew from the beginning that world exploration progress would be useful. I didn't expect that there would be such a good thing as the reward space ring at this % progress, so powerful. If it reaches 20.00%, or even higher progress, there must be better rewards waiting for him at that time. Thinking of this beautifully. Only then did Morgan retract his gaze and look at the virtual data column in front of him again. Sure enough, the achievement reward was given to the Queen. The light green glow in the current world exploration progress column is gone. After carefully looking at the entire data panel, Morgan turned his gaze back to the column representing his 4 attributes and the column representing skills. Then it's time to strengthen. Morgan immediately cheered up and began to examine and analyze carefully. Look at the ability bar first. It goes without saying that the universal language cannot be strengthened. Muay Thai LV2 is not very useful to him now, and he will not care about it at all for the time being. White Crow Sword Technique LV2. Looking at the data with a pale white light in front of him, Morgan thought about it secretly. The last time he strengthened was in Rivendell, the capital of elves. Raised the White Crow Swordsmanship to LV2. Next, for nearly a month, because of uninterrupted exercise, Morgan's proficiency in the White Crow Sword technique has also improved rapidly. Although I dare not speak out and grasp this kind of words thoroughly. But after the Battle of the Underground Goblin Kingdom, and the Battle of the Orcs, Morgan's White Crow swordsmanship can definitely be regarded as entering the room. This is also the reason why he dared to match Thorin Oakeshield's swordsmanship. Archery is certainly important. But melee swordsmanship is also very important, even more important than archery to a certain extent. If it weren't for the fact that he has worked tirelessly to practice the White Crow swordsmanship for the past month. This time Morgan's trip to the Underground Kingdom, facing the countless goblin monsters, he is likely to overturn and belch there. Thinking of this, Morgan's thoughts moved slightly, and the first bit of soul power was resolutely focused on the White Crow sword technique. This strengthening consumes one soul power, whether to strengthen it. Strengthen. White Crow sword technique LV3. Chapter 74. Special skill, Body of Rock. White Crow sword technique LV3. Feel a familiar and comfortable heat being injected into the body. Morgan only felt that the exhaustion of the past few days was immediately dispelled. Although the wounds of different sizes on the body are still aching. But this is trauma. Although the enhanced heat flow of the system can dispel Morgan's fatigue, it cannot directly heal Morgan's injuries. But it is certain that it will help the injury to improve. I realized that there was an unfamiliar memory fragment in my mind. Morgan felt it for a while, and knew that it was about the deeper skills and understanding of White Crow sword art. Did not understand carefully. Looking at the White Crow swordsmanship of LV3 again, Morgan suddenly clicked again. This strengthening consumes 3 soul power, whether to strengthen it. Look at the enhanced prompt that pops up. Morgan thought to himself, it really is. After the bow and archery was strengthened to LV3 last time, it will take 3 points of soul power to continue to strengthen it once. The White Crow sword art is the same now, it seems that the LV3 level is a stage. Continuing to strengthen is the next stage. However, Morgan's LV3 level of archery had already been strengthened when he was in Rivendell. After nearly a month of practice, although most of the time was spent practicing White Crow swordsmanship. But Morgan felt that he had already mastered about half of LV3's archery skills. Although he hasn't fully grasped it yet, Morgan has already felt the power of LV3 level archery. He is looking forward to the next strengthening. But before he can fully master the LV3 level bow and archery that he strengthened last time, Morgan does not intend to continue strengthening for the time being. The same is true for the White Crow swordsmanship, wait until you have fully mastered the LV3 level White Crow swordsmanship. Morgan will continue to strengthen. Only by laying a solid enough foundation can it be more conducive to future growth. If you rush to strengthen it now, it is almost equivalent to starting to run before learning to walk. Morgan wouldn't make that mistake. The strengthening of abilities and skills has temporarily come to an end. The next step is to strengthen the 4 attributes. Let's take a look at Morgan's current attributes: Strength LV2, Constitution LV3, Agility LV3, Spirit LV3. Then he glanced at the remaining 13 points of soul power in the soul power bar. This time we can do a big job. Looking back and forth on the 4 attributes, Morgan secretly said. This time, Morgan's eyes first stayed on the physical attributes. After 2 consecutive days of extremely high-intensity fighting, he fled. Morgan can persist without showing fatigue, relying on his strong physique. Among the members of the expedition team, except for Gandalf Morgan, he couldn't see the depth. The physical strength of the other dwarves should have almost reached their limit. Especially Thorin. Oak Shield. Because of his special status, whether it was being humiliated and tortured by the group of goblin monsters in the underground kingdom, he was besieged and taken care of. After rushing out of the underground kingdom, he was chased by the half-orcs, and was picked up and beaten by the powerful half-orc leader Azog. Thorin Oakenshield's physical fatigue was very obvious. Morgan does not want to encounter a similar situation one day in the future. Thinking of this, Morgan decisively clicked behind the physique attribute, and then clicked again. 2 pale white rays of light flickered in succession. Physique LV4. Physique LV5. Physique LV5 comprehends the special skill Body of Rock. Body of Rock mastered. Special skill. Body of Rock. Looking at the virtual prompt that quickly jumped out in front of him, Morgan's expression immediately brightened. He is no stranger to special skills. Because he has now mastered a special skill Intimacy. Morgan has only used the power of Intimacy, special skill, once so far. That time when he met Gandalf, Morgan was eager to join the expedition, so he used this skill on Gandalf. Intimacy did not disappoint Morgan, even though Gandalf's true identity is the demigod who descended from Maya. The results of Intimacy are also almost immediate. This allowed Morgan to truly see the power of special skills. Intimacy is when Morgan first came to Middle-earth, when the Transmigrator system appeared on him. With the power of Intimacy, Morgan guessed that this was a gift package for beginners given to him by the system. Thinking about it this way, the Transmigrator system is still very generous to Morgan. It is to know the intimate power of special skills. The first time Morgan saw the prompt data in front of him, the excited face immediately immersed in my mind and quickly felt it. Sure enough, there was already a strange and familiar memory picture in my mind. The strangeness is because this memory picture appeared in Morgan's mind out of thin air, and it was the first time I saw it. Familiarity means that Morgan's body is very proficient in the memory picture displayed by this memory, so proficient that he can naturally produce conditioned reflexes. He feels that he can use it at any time now. Is this a special skill? It's really different. Silently feeling the special skills that appeared in his mind, Morgan couldn't help murmuring. After strengthening the skills and abilities, Morgan needs to spend a lot of time practicing before he can make the strengthened abilities his own. After strengthening the 4 major attributes, Morgan needs to adapt slowly at first, although it is much better now. But Morgan felt that he had mastered the special skill Body of Rock that he had now comprehended. Yes, he didn't boast, he has indeed mastered it. Body of Rock, the instant it is activated, it allows the user to have a defense comparable to the hardest stone. Intimacy is a social support skill. Body of Rock is a defensive auxiliary skill. The more he felt the ability of Body of Rock, the more satisfied Morgan was with this special skill. At this moment, Morgan, who was excited in his heart, suddenly activated Rock Body secretly. For a moment, Morgan felt as if his whole body was covered with an extremely thick layer of armor. He stretched out his finger and poked his chest suddenly. Bang bang! Then there were 2 muffled sounds that sounded like hands hitting stones. Morgan's eyes lit up, and he immediately squeezed his hand to the other. The hand still looks like the original hand, but it feels cold and rough to the touch, just like touching a real stone. Morgan's eyes became brighter. He thought for a while, then reached out to touch his nipples again. Rough, cold, hard, good. Just didn't wait for him to play more. At this moment, he suddenly felt that the thick armor covering his body was rapidly disappearing. Is it time? Morgan secretly thought. He touched his arm again. Sure enough, it has returned to normal. How long did it last from start to finish? Just as Morgan was estimating the duration of Body of Rock, he suddenly felt a little tired. What's going on? I just strengthened it many times in a row. And many more. Is this the cost of using Body of Rock, or is it the price? Morgan secretly said in his heart. Yes, that's the only explanation. It seems that the night I met Gandalf a few months ago, I felt a similar feeling of fatigue after I activated Intimacy. I just didn't notice it, I thought it was a normal reaction after a busy day. Morgan nodded secretly. He already had a general understanding of special skills and Body of Rock. He glanced at the soul power bar, there were still 11 points left. You can comprehend special skills when your physique is strengthened to LV5, so will the other 3 attributes be the same. Thinking of this, let's look at the other 3 attributes. At this moment, Morgan's eyes were shining. Chapter 75. Strength soars. Morgan took a deep breath and calmed down. The special skill Body of Rock is extremely useful. Next, there are 3 other attributes. If you can really strengthen LV5 like the physical attributes, you can comprehend special skills. That would be amazing. After strengthening this time, his strength is definitely far beyond that before strengthening. The improvement is by no means a little bit. He shook his head to make himself more awake. Morgan immediately heard the wind whizzing past his ears. Only then did he realize that he was still on the back of the giant eagle. He was too engrossed in the strengthening just now, and the appearance of the special skill Body of Rock really made him so happy. Standing up and looking up at the surroundings, it is still high in the sky, and white clouds can be seen in the distance. Below is the vast mountain forest that stretches as far as the eye can see. Looking forward, there are members of the expedition team on the back of the giant eagle in front. After the fresh momentum of going up to the sky at the beginning, there was no movement at this time. At this time, most of them obviously fell asleep. Because Morgan heard the snoring of dwarves brought by the wind ahead. He was all too familiar with the voice. Watching this group of giant eagles should not stop for a while. Morgan lay down again. Summon the Transmigrator System data panel again. Morgan immediately looked at the soul bar. The 2 reinforcements only used up 3 points of soul power, leaving 11 points. His eyes returned to the property bar again. The physique attribute has been strengthened to LV5, and I have also comprehended special skills, so I can stop for now. Strengthen other attributes first. Thinking of this, Morgan suddenly tapped behind physique LV5 again. A strengthening prompt jumped out immediately. This strengthening consumes 3 soul power, whether to strengthen it. Sure enough, just like strengthening bow and arrow and white crow swordsmanship, the higher the level, the more soul power you need. Looking at the prompt in front of him, Morgan thought to himself. Shaking his head, Morgan continued to look at the other 3 attributes. The agility and spirit attributes are both LV3, and the strength attribute is only LV2. There are still 11 points of soul power, which is enough to strengthen all the other 3 attributes to LV5, which is more than enough. Morgan didn't think too much about it anymore, he raised his hand and clicked on the lowest strength attribute, making 3 shots in a row. Power LV3. Power LV4. Pale white light kept flickering. A series of virtual prompts kept jumping and appearing in front of them. Power LV5. Strength LV5 comprehends the special skill Dragon Power. Dragon Power. Mastered. It did appear. Dragon Power. Looking at the virtual information that keeps jumping out in front of him, Morgan was overjoyed. The special skill Dragon Power is related to strength at first glance. Sure enough, no matter which attribute is strengthened, the special skills comprehended are closely related to the strengthened attribute. Morgan immediately settled down to feel the changes in his mind. Sure enough, a group of strange and familiar memory pictures immediately appeared in my mind. It is the same as the special skill Body of Rock comprehended before. Morgan's spirit had just been touched, and the memory picture quickly disappeared. But the information contained in it was extremely deeply imprinted in Morgan's mind and body. Morgan silently felt the specific ability of this special skill. Soon, he figured out the specific ability and usage of Dragon Power. Dragon Power, at the moment of activation, the user can burst out a terrifying power comparable to that of a giant dragon in a very short period of time. Of course, the power comparable to the legendary creature dragon is just an exaggerated rhetorical technique. The specific power that Dragon Power can erupt in an instant, Morgan estimates should be 2 to 3 times his own power. The duration of the burst should be around 3 to 5 seconds. The duration of Body of Rock is less than half, and the duration of Body of Rock is about 10 seconds. Morgan just experimented. However, considering that Body of Rock is an auxiliary defense special skill, and Dragon Power is an explosive attack special skill, the burst time of 3 to 5 seconds is actually enough. Of course, the specific length of time will only be known after Morgan's experiment. But based on the information he feels now, Morgan is already very satisfied with Dragon Power. Think about it, in battle, the enemy who was originally equal in strength, and evenly matched with you suddenly burst out with strength several times that of yours at a critical moment without warning. If you are caught off guard, you can turn the tide of the battle in an instant and kill you in one hit. This is completely regarded as a special skill equivalent to a killer's mace. Morgan was happy about it, satisfied. Of course, he was happier. Both physique and strength attributes can be enhanced to LV5 to comprehend special skills. This means that the remaining 2 attributes of agility and spirit can give him 2 more special skills. Just thinking about it made him excited. Morgan didn't delay, lest someone say he was out of water again. Looking back at the virtual data panel in front of him again, he looked at the remaining 2 attributes. Morgan raised his hand and made a couple of shots. Agile LV4. Agile LV5. Agile LV5 comprehends the special skill Charge. Charge. Mastered. A series of dummy data keeps jumping and flickering. Morgan's focused eyes quickly saw the most important content among the several prompts. Special skill, Charge. As soon as the name sounds, it is related to speed and agility. Morgan looked delighted, not waiting for the prompt to complete the data. Immediately sync your mind and enter your mind. Soon, he felt that there was an extra memory picture in his mind exuding white light. Just a little mental touch, the pale white light ball immediately shattered into light spots and disappeared quickly. A large amount of information contained in the light cluster was deeply imprinted in Morgan's mind and body. Silently understand the specific ability of this special skill. Soon, Morgan knew the specific ability and usage of Charge. Charge, the moment it is launched, it can quickly shorten the distance between the enemy and us. As for the distance that the charge can reach, it should be between 20 meters and 30 meters. The specifics will be known only after Morgan personally tests it. The introduction of Charge is relatively simple compared to the 2 special skills Body of Rock and Dragon Power. The name Charge is also very unpretentious. But Morgan grinned when he realized this special skill for the first time. He had played many games in his previous life, and the skill of charging was not uncommon, and it could even be listed as one of the magic skills of the warrior profession. Whether it is used to attack or retreat, it is very sudden. This can be said to be extremely suitable for the current Morgan. So far, the special skills comprehended by the 3 major attributes strengthened to LV5 are more practical than the other. This made Morgan look forward to the last spiritual attribute, which is also the most special attribute, and what skills he can comprehend. After digesting the special skill charge, Morgan looked at the last spiritual attribute, and without hesitation, he raised his hand to make a 2-up. Spirit LV4. Spirit LV5. Spiritual LV5 comprehends the special skill Spiritual Shock. Spirit Shock. Mastered.